and so another uncomfortable night for sleeping for some of us. More showers across the east first through tomorrow morning, but they will quickly clear away. However, more showers could then develop as we go into the afternoon, and again some of these could be thundery. Further west it's a drier picture until later on when a system comes in bringing some clouds, some wet and windy weather across parts of Northern Ireland and western Scotland. Temperatures are going to be gradually dropping, though still some high temperatures in the far east. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You really could become the next big Great British Giveaway winner with your chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash to spend on anything you like. Listen to what some of our previous winners have to say about winning big with us.
On the day that I got the money in the bank account, everything just seemed a lot sunnier.
But I do have something to spend it on.
Just go for it. It's an absolute must.
Thank you, GBNews.
Amazing feeling to win.
For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text CASH to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2 or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrants must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us! Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way.
Might be cold in this studio.
That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
she could have said Stump.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 12 o'clock on Thursday, the 1st of August. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Emma Webb.
The Bank of England are expected to make their decision on interest rates any moment now. Will they cut those rates for the first time in almost a year? Well, joining us now is Mark Littlewood, the economist and director of Popular Conservatism. Mark, obviously the markets have one view. What do you reckon will happen in the next 30 seconds?
I'm a free marketeer. I'm not going to defy the markets. They say there's a good chance there'll be a quarter of
Mark,
a percent
I'm
up.
going to interrupt you right now because we have the news. The Bank of England have cut rates by 0.25%.
Bang
rates
on
have
cue.
fallen down to 5%. Mark, I interrupted your prediction as your prediction became true.
There you go. Bang on the money. Bang on the money. I think I beat the news by a fleeting second. I think on balance, this is good news, Tom. Inflation is back under control. The Bank of England is supposed to use interest rates to keep inflation around 2%, and it's pretty much bang on that level at the moment. I would say this, though, in the wider debate. We seem to have got ourselves into the ludicrous position of believing that the lower interest rates are, the better. Could we please cut them to 4%, 3%, go back to them being negative in real terms? That's to say interest rates below inflation. That would be catastrophic for the economy. And I think the Bank of England's failure over recent years is they were too slow to put interest rates up. So we saw inflation peak at over 11%, and they've probably now been, over the last year or so, too slow to cut them again.
So how is this going to affect normal people in terms of, people who have got mortgages, people who are maybe thinking about moving house, those who are looking to buy, maybe for the first time?
If you are a borrower or want to become a borrower, you want very low interest rates. Already some of the banks are cutting their mortgage rates, I think in anticipation of this statement. Probably we're on a downward trajectory, one would guess, over the coming months. So if you're wanting to take out a colossal loan, whether that is to buy a house or anything else, it's good news if interest rates are falling. And that's usually what we focus on, those with mortgages in particular. But if you're a saver, low interest rates are very bad news indeed. And if you want the highest rate of return possible. And you don't get a great rate of return by putting your money in a savings account. Sure, you'll be able to buy more stuff at the end of the year than you could buy at the start of the year, but only by a whisker. And for the economy as a whole, good rule of thumb, interest rates should probably be 2-3% above inflation at any given time. That's about where we've got to. So one piece of good news in broken Britain, normality has returned, at least as far as inflation and interest rates are concerned.
But of course, many people will remember the early to mid-1990s when interest rates in 1992 reached the insane level of sort of, 13, 14%, I think, at one point on Black Wednesday. This is obviously a lot lower. But perhaps the reason people feel it more perniciously is that they were so much lower for such a long time. People have made huge investments, borrowed huge amounts of money, expecting interest rates to stay at 0.51%. And so the rate of change is perhaps what has mattered more here than the absolute level.
I think you're absolutely right about that, Tom. In effect, since the global financial crash of 2008, we've all been going around getting drunk on cheap credit. Spending money rather than saving it. One of the reasons that investment is so low is with low interest rates, there is very, very little incentive to save money. Buy things now, because they're probably going to be more expensive if you wait a month or a year. So having got used to that, we now need to get back to something approaching normality. I don't think politicians have been particularly good at pointing that out to people, to listen to politicians of all stripes over the last 2 years. You would have thought it was a national priority to keep interest rates low. As I say, this return to normality, having got drunk, there may be a bit of a hangover for people, but this is the new normal.
Labour in this sort of living off the family silver, in that this is really the result of the work of the Conservative government. So how do you think interest rates will be affected by Labour policies going forward?
Well, it depends. An awful lot depends on the overall credibility of the government. If Labour spend money we don't have, that tends to fuel inflation. And the remit of the Bank of England, although I have to say it's often observed in the breach rather than rigorously followed, is they are supposed to have one tool, one golf club, to achieve one aim, inflation of 2%. So if you are concerned, which I am to some degree, that Labour will go on a spending spree and this could fuel inflation, already we're hearing public sector workers, 5.5% pay rise. If you think there's going to be more and more of that, we might see inflation return, and that would mean interest rates going up again.
Although, Mark, obviously Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, used to work at the Bank of England, has the blood of the Bank of England going through her veins, for better or for worse.
Probably for worse.
Clearly, she has spent a lot of money in her first few days as Chancellor. She's been spending £10 billion on public sector pay rises. Given her history at the Bank of England, she'll be wanting to pay for that rather than borrow more money, is very likely. So we're going to see tax rises. We're going to see tax rises in October, when there will be this new budget, this full statement from the Chancellor. What taxes will rise? And does this interest rate cut make tax rises now more likely?
I don't think it necessarily makes them more likely. They're pretty inevitable anyway. And we can be pretty certain whatever tax rises come, they'll be pretty inefficient ones, because for political reasons, Labour rolled out a whole menu of taxes that wouldn't go up, income tax and national insurance and the like, which then basically anything they didn't rule out is now on the table for how you might be able to raise more revenue. So it's unlikely to be done from sound, sane economic thinking, more a reflection of the promises they felt they had to make for electoral reasons, and then hell's teeth, where do we actually grab some money from? But here's the problem I think Rachel Reeves is going to run into. We are now basically, in roundabout terms, taxing the British economy to the maximum. No government of any stripe in my lifetime has managed to squeeze more than about 38% of national income out in tax. And we've tried virtually every array of tax policies you could possibly imagine
We've
over
had
the
top
last
rates beyond 90%.
and as low as 40. We've had VAT between 5 and 20%. You name it, we've tried it. And it does seem, just as an empirical fact, 38% is about the most any government of any stripe can squeeze out of the economy if it's determined to get every last penny it can from the private sector. And we're about at that number. So I actually think we're going to have to see spending cuts at some point really do the heavy lifting here, because you can't just keep putting up tax rates and assume that revenue will follow if you are already taxing the economy to the maximum.
But how willing are Labour to make those spending cuts if they're going to have a sort of gold rush for public sector salaries once they've sort of given some leeway to the junior doctors and will be hounded by others asking for more and more pay rises and more industrial action?
Yep.
How are they going to make those cuts? And even if they did make cuts, you know, through certain efficiencies, maybe even in the civil service, that's not going to be able to raise all of the funds that they need.
No, it's not. It's a very good question. My default fear is that Labour will spend beyond the means of taxpayers to an even greater degree than the Conservatives did over 14 years.
And the inflation
However, from a purely economic standpoint, you can argue about the politics of it or the fairness of it. We have seen announcements on winter fuel allowances being cut back. We might see other welfare cuts. So perhaps Rachel Reeves is giving with one hand to public sector unions, Labour's staunch allies, and taking with the other from affluent pensioners who tend to vote Conservative.
In some ways, what we saw between 2010 and 2024 was austerity for anyone under the age of 65 and a pretty generous sort of social democracy for anyone over the age of 65. Are we about to see that equation flip? And instead, we're going to see more taxes and fewer benefits for the old, but much more spending for those in work?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that much more spending for those in work might be. If you are a public sector worker, you might get an above-inflation pay rise. But if you're working in the private sector, and let's say in your 20s or early 30s, I wouldn't be counting your chickens just yet.
Unless you're one of those workers who's on universal credit.
Yeah, that's possible. It's possible. But I think the truth of the matter is there is very, very limited room in the spending envelope here. I think the best thing that the government could do is to try and get down taxes on the key things that would encourage growth. We hear from politicians of all parties about we've got to get growth. This is apparently what the Labour Party are going to bring about, but not too many concrete plans for actually getting there. It seems to be a wish and a prayer rather than a strategy. There's going to be a few things about skills investment and the rest of it. But the truth is you get growth if you deregulate and cut tax in the wider economy.
Are they also going to chase those higher earners out of the country by potentially raising certain taxes and, you know, the impact that they might have on, say, you know, because of net zero policies and whatnot? They therefore will lose the taxes that they could have got from those people. Meanwhile, they're talking about putting over 800 million into HMRC itself in order to try and make it more efficient at, as you were saying, squeezing every last penny from the British people.
Yeah, I mean, look, always the easiest thing, if you're a politician trying to balance the books, is that you sort of wish your way to believing there can be colossal efficiency gains. If we save a bit more on paper clips over there, or have a better filing system over here, or, God help us, a new IT system to make things work better, that's what they reach for. Truth of the matter is, over the medium term, our public finances are not sustainable. We're now more than £2.5 trillion in debt as a cash balance. We have huge liabilities that we've not saved for. Public sector pensions, we've not put a penny aside for. If any pensions company had operated like the government has done over the last 30 years, its directors would be in prison. So we have these huge things coming down the road. But politicians, you know, tend only to think, not really even in a 5-year time horizon, but in sort of how do I get through the next budget or the next few months. So the inevitable consequence, I'm making a mathematical point here, not an ideological one, is that government spending is going to have to fall at some point.
And yet, Mark, to zoom back to where we are today, and perhaps to try and paint a sunnier picture than the long-term fiscal cliff that perhaps we're talking about, why on earth did Rishi Sunak call the general election at a time when we hadn't had a single interest rate cut, at a time when we hadn't had the news about the UK economy growing actually faster than comparable European G7 countries, and at a time when frankly we'd only seen inflation down for 1 month. Now we've seen inflation down for multiple months. Growth is due to be the highest in the G7 this year, and now we've had an interest rate cut. I mean, surely if there was a time to call the general election, it would have been now. Instead, he's gifted this to the opposition, now the government.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what the then Prime Minister was predicting about the economy, but I think waiting would have been a better option. My theory is, but I don't know for sure, is that his rationale was not based on the economy. It was based on his fear that Rwanda flights would not get off the ground over the summer, that the small boats crisis would get worse, and if he called a snap election, he'd be able to catch all his political opponents off guard. Unfortunately, by calling the election, he didn't catch any of his political opponents off guard. He caught his own party off guard. The Conservatives were caught off guard. So I think it will go down as a rash and incorrect tactical decision. Frankly, I don't think the Conservatives would have won in November anyway, but if there was good economic news coming, you might speculate that they would have won more than 121 seats when it came to it.
Perhaps only a 1997-style loss as opposed to the worst loss in the history of the Conservative Party. Mark Littlewood, thank you so much for talking through the wider economic context there. Well, we've had a statement from the Chancellor. In the last few minutes, Rachel Reeves has said that whilst today's cut in interest rates will be welcome news, millions of families are still facing higher mortgage rates after the mini-budget. That is why the government is taking the difficult decisions now to fix the foundations of our economy after years of low growth, so we can rebuild Britain and make every part of our country better off. Still, they're trying to blame Liz Truss for interest rates now at 5%. I mean, that's
they must have done something right, because it can't have been achieved by the short amount of time Labour have been in power.
And I'm fairly sure interest rates are higher in the United States than they are in Britain now. So I don't know if that's Liz Truss's fault as well. Anyway.
Coming up, a 17-year-old has been charged with the murder of the 3 girls in Southport and 10 counts of attempted murder, and will appear today at Liverpool Crown Court. We're there after this.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, to enrich us on the best cheeses and wine to buy, I'm delighted to be joined by the CEO of Inflorescence, Jacinta Madison-Wilson. Jacinta, thank you so much for joining us in the studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also, thank you so much for bringing what is
what a Sunday you're having.
of wonderful... What do we have before us?
So, we've got 3 gorgeous wines to try today. We've got an English sparkling, we've got a beautiful rosé and a dessert wine, and, of course, cheese.
Wonderful.
And paired them all beautifully.
Now, English sparkling wine has had a bit of a renaissance.
Oh, it's incredible, isn't it?
To use a French word to describe English sparkling wine. It's having a bit of a moment in the sun.
Absolutely. I just think it's so exciting that this is right on our doorstep, essentially. An hour out of London, and we're around beautiful vineyards.
The chalk sort of sediment is exactly the same as the Champagne region.
Absolutely. Yeah, our soils are really similar. We use the same grape varieties a lot of the time. We make it in exactly the same way as Champagne. Our climate is like champagne was 40 to 50 years ago. So we're really kind of drinking it blind. You almost wouldn't know that you're not drinking champagne. But it's right here on our doorstep. We can stay local now.
Absolutely marvellous. Well, we've got... So what is the best order to start?
OK, well, we're going to start with sparkling, because all things in life should start with sparkling. I got married a month ago, and this was actually the... Thank you so much. This was the wine I chose to have as our first wine that we served the guests. This is from a winery called Bluebell, which is in Sussex, and I've chosen to pair this with a lovely... kind of the English version of Camembert, which is called Tunworth. Okay. It's a very classic pairing of champagne and brie. So we're kind of going to do the English version of that now.
Classic.
Absolutely. Are you ready to get stuck in?
I am so...
OK.
Hang on. Is it cheese first or wine first?
I'd have a little sip of the wine first.
Sip of the wine,
have a little bite of the cheese, and then some more wine. Get it all mixed up in there.
It's like a cheese sandwich.
Exactly. Yes.
OK, here
Cheers.
we go. Cheers.
GB News, the People's Channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 17 minutes past 12.
Now, the 17-year-old male charged with the murder of 3 girls in Southport is appearing before Liverpool's Crown Court.
Riots were sparked across the country following the horrific incident, with protesters clashing with police in London, Manchester and Hartlepool.
Angry crowds threw flares and bottles at the gates of Downing Street, and over 100 people have now been arrested. Well, there were similar scenes too in Hartlepool.
In response, Keir Starmer has called police chiefs of Downing Street for an urgent meeting on the riots and the police action taken against them.
Well, let's speak to GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White, live for us on Downing Street. Mark, the police are arriving this afternoon. What do you expect the conversation will focus on?
Well, the conversation will be, without doubt, on the concerns that there obviously is about the potential for the disorder that we've seen over the last couple of nights, which appears to have clearly spread, as it wasn't just this time a problem that Southport faced, but it was different locations with Manchester, with Aldershot and with Hartlepool, as well as here in London, facing a number of protests that then sparked disorder. And the Metropolitan Police have confirmed just within the last few minutes that they have now made 111 arrests here in connection with the protests and the disorder that were witnessed in Whitehall. So some real concern, I think, about the potential for this to spread. We don't have to think too far back. 2011, well, I remember it well anyway, because I was in the midst of the riots that were sparked after the shooting of Mark Duggan by armed police, and that initially set off unrest in Tottenham and North London, but then in the following days it spread right across London and right across England and parts of Wales as well. So there is very understandable concern amongst policing leaders and political leaders about the potential for this disorder to spread. They will be looking at, for instance, mutual aid and how that might best be teed up to be able to respond quickly to areas of concern. And as part of that, we understand that some policing leaders who have responsibility for resilience across national policing will be here at Downing Street as well.
Police have responded, shall we say, quite robustly to these protests. You say the number of people that have been arrested. Why wouldn't the government have called a similar meeting with police chiefs following, for example, the rioting in Leeds? I think many people at home will be wondering whether that might be a subject of discussion, that the police have shown themselves capable of policing protests like this.
Well, there's certainly a great deal of concern amongst many people that there is a level of two-tier policing, that they believe politicians as well have not condemned the Hare Hills riots that broke out in quite the robust terms that they have done in the days since, when other protests have broken out. But I think the response here in terms of what they are meeting about is clearly with regard to 2 nights where we've seen a number of significant protests and the concern that they have about that spreading to other areas.
Now, Mark, of course, this will be a very serious meeting. The Prime Minister had, in his previous role as Director of Public Prosecutions, dealt with swift prosecutions for those 2011 riots that were sparked off the back of Mark Duggan. Do you think he'll be bringing his experience there with regard to this incident, or is it going to be a less serious incident? Because ultimately, we haven't seen the same level of mass vandalism or looting that we saw in 2011.
Listen, that is always a potential possibility and something that the government would have up its sleeve going forward as a way of dealing with very significant numbers of protesters, people arrested, if that was to happen. We're not nearly on the scale of what happened back in 2011, and then, of course, we had these special courts right across the country that were able to deal with those arrested even on weekends to ensure that they were through the criminal justice system, at least the early stages of the court process, very quickly, and we're not going to clog up the court process, and also that people were in some instances taken off the street and not able to continue with the protests or the violent disorder that was taking place.
Well, Mark White, thank you very much for joining us live on Downing Street. We'll be back with you as those police chiefs appear on the street behind you, and let's hopefully get some words with them as well.
Now, BBC Director General Tim Davie is to face tough questions from the government about the corporation, about what the corporation knew about Huw Edwards' case after the veteran broadcaster admitted accessing indecent images of children.
Well, the corporation said it knew of the veteran broadcaster's arrest on suspicion of serious offences in November, but continued employing him until April, indeed paying him £200,000.
Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy is very likely to raise questions to the BBC chief about why he continued to receive his salary, which marked a £40,000 pay rise from 2022 to 2023.
Well, let's speak now to GB News political editor Christopher Hope. Because, Christopher, this is the big question. Of course, before Huw Edwards' arrest, it's a different conversation. But as far as we know, the senior people within the BBC knew of an arrest on serious grounds of Huw Edwards and continued to pay his salary for months.
Tom and Emma, that is right, and good afternoon. Yes, the meeting will happen over the phone between Lisa Nandy, who's the Culture Secretary, and Tim Davie, who's the BBC Director General. Lisa Nandy, of course, has got her duties supporting Team GB at the Olympics in France. So it'll be a phone call or a Zoom call, not in person. This meeting, I understand from very senior BBC sources I've spoken to very recently. What they say to me is they were aware of the arrest last November, but they couldn't do anything until the charging decision was made. And by the time he was charged, of course, Huw Edwards had left the BBC, but he was paid that £200,000 figure of licence fee payers' money. And the question Lisa Nandy will say is, was it necessary to keep paying him when you knew he'd been arrested? The BBC will say back, well, we couldn't do anything until he'd been charged. There have been other high-profile cases in the past when there has been an arrest and no charges were brought forward. And there will be a risk there that, obviously, everyone's innocent until proven guilty and the like. So they couldn't do anything until he was properly charged. And then, of course, by then he had left the BBC. But that meeting will happen over the phone this afternoon, and we'll hear more. And the meeting has been called by Lisa Nandy in the wake of the Huw Edwards guilty plea yesterday on the child pornography offences. They have met before, Tim Davie and Lisa Nandy, since she became Culture Secretary, so it's not a normal meeting, but of course it's a meeting trying to demonstrate concern from the government about the use of licence fee payers' money paying Huw Edwards after he was arrested.
Chris, especially given everything that happened recently with Strictly, do you think this might reignite criticisms of the licence fee? Because obviously the previous government was a lot more critical of the BBC licence fee than the current government has been expected to be. Might this reignite those concerns within the Labour Party and within the current government?
Well, it might do, Emma. I mean, we heard from Sir Keir Starmer on that visit to the NATO summit. He is going to keep the licence fee going. There had been an idea, hadn't there, under the last Tory government to create it replace it with a subscription model, perhaps like Netflix, or a two-tier model for different ways of funding it. That worry has gone away. So that stick with which the Tory government beat the management at BBC with has gone away, I think. But no question. I mean, this is our money. We all pay the licence fee, we all watch the BBC. Was this the right way to behave? The BBC will be saying today, well, they couldn't do anything until a charging decision, and by the time that happened, he had left with rather a curt response from Tim Davie early this year. So they will say we did all we could, because if you flip it and he hadn't been charged, then they would have dismissed this individual, Huw Edwards, based on an arrest, but no charge came from that. So it may have meant a bigger sum in compensation for Huw Edwards had no charges been made. So I think they felt they were in a difficult position, I think, as soon as this arrest happened last November.
And yet this is why it sticks in the back of the throat for so many people. This is perhaps why there is a greater burden upon the BBC to be that much more cautious than just about any other body, because it's not a private body, it's a public body. It's not a body that is privately funded. It is funded by what is, in effect, a tax that if you're to watch any live television, you have to pay your tithe to the BBC. So don't they have, perhaps, to go above and beyond what would normally be expected in cases like this? And if, as it seems they were made aware of a serious arrest, an arrest on serious grounds, that they couldn't sit back and twiddle their thumbs?
Well, the question is, could they have got rid of Huw Edwards last November when the arrest happened? And clearly there was some advice within the BBC to say we have to wait until a charging point. That's what companies do. And, of course, they didn't even know about the charging when it happened, when it was announced, I should say, by the CPS on Monday, because, of course, he was no longer an employee at the BBC. But you're right, I think the BBC is held to a much higher standard, and rightly so, because we do pay this licence fee. We all pay it for our live TV, and that's a question they'll have to answer themselves. And whether Tim Davie announces some form of a review of how to treat employees who are facing investigations and arrests, and when they should make that decision to cut these people loose, that could be an idea coming from this meeting. But we'll wait and see this afternoon.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for talking us through what will be an extraordinary meeting between the Culture Secretary and the BBC. And, Emma, I think that this is putting the BBC under a spotlight at just the moment it doesn't need to be under a spotlight. You're right to raise the Strictly case as well. It all sort of ties together.
But it happens time and time and time again that it seems the BBC fail in safeguarding on various ways. I mean, everybody, I'm sure, can think of a handful of examples where we've had scandals like this with the BBC. And people at home will be wanting to know this, as you said it's an effective effectively it's a tax, they'll be wanting to know that this isn't going to an institution that is harbouring wrong uns and protecting them.
I think that's what many people will be thinking, especially those that have seen their licence fee go up, and especially the fact that, frankly, fewer and fewer people are paying. It's such a peculiar model that then brings this institution, which I think a lot of people would want to be proud of. It's one of the things that people associate with Britain. It's one of those national brands.
And
no one wants to see it disappear.
You have vulnerable people, elderly people being harassed by, demands to pay the licence fee, people being sort of pulled up by the law on it, and at the same time you have an institution that just doesn't seem to learn its lessons. I think people will feel quite sore about being forced to pay money towards an institution that is doing such a sort of bad job of protecting people in its orbit.
Absolutely. Well, do get involved. gbnews.com/your say is the way to join that conversation. But now, some breaking news just into us. The 17-year-old male charged with the murder of 3 girls killed in Southport has been named. Yes, the 17-year-old male has been named as Axel Rudakubana. Axel Rudakubana. That's after he appeared before Liverpool's Crown Court.
Reporting restrictions have been lifted on the case, and we will have more for you shortly.
Well, we'll have much more on that 17-year-old because we have got that name. Again, under 18s, if they appear before court, if they're arrested, even if they're charged, they traditionally are not allowed to be named. We have been forbidden from sharing this name over the last 3 days. But today, now, we can share that name.
Many people, I think, have been feeling very, very frustrated about the lack of information that had come out. Of course, the police extended the amount of time that they had before charging this man. And people have been really desperate to understand more about the person behind this absolutely horrific attack that has rocked the country.
The suspect that could be behind this case, as yet innocent until proven guilty. Again, the 3 girls who have tragically been killed are here on our screen, including a 9-year-old girl, a 7-year-old girl and a 6-year-old girl. It is just the most shocking case. And our reporter, Charlie Peters, has been there in court, watching the defendant, watching Axel walk there to the dock. Our reporter has been reporting that the defendant smirked up at the press gallery as he walked in to that court. We'll have much more after your headlines with Sophia.
Thank you, Tom. It's 12:33. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. And as you've just been hearing, some breaking news, the 17-year-old male charged with the murder of the 3 girls killed in Southport has been named as Axel Rudakubana after he appeared before Liverpool's Crown Court. Reporting restrictions have been lifted on the case, and we will have more for you shortly. Meanwhile, it was another night... It was another night of violence across Britain last night, with angry crowds taking to the streets of Manchester, Hartlepool and London, encouraged by false social media posts regarding the Southport attack. Some declared their support for Tommy Robinson, saying, "We want our country back." More than 100 people were arrested in the capital, while Cleveland police made 8 arrests, with more expected. The Prime Minister is due to discuss the situation with police leaders today. And some breaking news in the last half hour. The Bank of England has cut interest rates to 5%, marking the first reduction since March 2020. The base rate had been held at 5.25% since August last year, which was the highest level since 2008. Meanwhile, the Bank of England expects the UK economy to grow by 1.25% this year, higher than its last forecast. GPs in England have voted to limit the number of appointments available in their first collective action since 1964. NHS England says it could cause significant disruption across the whole health service. The British Medical Association says it's taking action over what it describes as a lack of funding for GPs. It comes despite the Health Secretary warning that while the previous government failed to recruit enough doctors, reducing services would only punish patients. The Culture Secretary will meet the head of the BBC today after it was revealed that former news presenter Huw Edwards was arrested in November but continued to be employed until April. He pleaded guilty yesterday to charges related to receiving indecent images of children during an online chat. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Hello, welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. It could be quite an impactful day today with torrential downpours, a risk of thunderstorms for many areas of England and Wales. Further north, it will be a drier day, but a change is on the way from Friday as these weather fronts will push in from the north and west, bringing some cloudier skies later on this afternoon to parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but it will brighten up for a time here. But it's further south across England and Wales where there's that risk of thunderstorms and the warning in force. We could see some very torrential downpours and localised impacts due to heavy rain and water on the roads. That could bring disruption to travel. So a humid feeling day as a result of that. Not everywhere's going to see these thunderstorms. You might get away with a fairly dry and sunny day. And actually, as I said, across parts of northern Scotland for this afternoon, it's going to brighten up for a time after a bit of a cloudier start this morning, but more rain is on the way throughout this evening. Across eastern areas of Scotland, risk of the odd shower, but some sunny spells, and it's a warmer day today here than yesterday. Parts of Northern Ireland as well, seeing a fine end to the day, but these thunderstorms across England and Wales will likely continue into this evening as it stays quite humid, so further disruption is likely into this evening and overnight. But it will slowly ease off overnight as that risk does fade away. So a fairly dry night to come once those thunderstorms do push away to the east for most of us, but across the north and west it is turning much wetter and windier overnight. For many of us, it's still staying quite humid and muggy, temperatures in the mid-teens as a minimum. But to start the day, there'll be plenty of brightness. So a brighter day, still that humid feel around, and that will allow some thunderstorms to break out potentially across eastern areas of England. But for most of us, a fairly dry day, or at least a start to the day, as we will see some wet and windy weather spread into parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland later on in the afternoon. But ahead of that, still feeling very warm in the sunshine. Bye-bye.
The latest GB News travel.
Northbound on the M1, a lane closure on the exit slip road to 28 for Mansfield due to a broken down vehicle. Traffic is coping well. Southbound on the M1, there's a lane closure and slow traffic to an accident between Rotherham at 35 through to Meadowhall at 34. Northbound on the M1, there's also a lane closure to barrier repairs from Milton Keynes at 14 through to Northampton at 15. Slow traffic as a result. Eastbound on the M20, there's a lane closure on the exit slip road to Maidstone at junction 7, and clockwise on the M25. Long delays and 2 lanes are now closed to an accident from Enfield at 25 through to Waltham Abbey at 26. Delays are back to Potters Bar at junction 24. There's also ongoing roadworks there. And that's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 39 minutes past midday.
Iman Khalif has won her first bout at the Olympics after Italian opponent Angela Carini abandoned the match after just 46 seconds, with the Algerian boxer cleared to compete in the women's event amid an eligibility row.
Well, Khalif's participation in the event has been a source of controversy, having been disqualified from the Women's World Boxing Championships last year because of elevated testosterone levels. Although it's important to note that this individual isn't transgender. She was born as a woman. Now, joining us to discuss this is the Director of Campaigns at Sex Matters, Fiona McAnena. Fiona, this is perhaps not much of a surprise to people that this person with elevated testosterone has won a boxing match.
Yeah, well, what happened here is that the Italian woman, at the height of her career, basically had to concede for her own safety. We don't know who would have won if they'd gone on to fight, but that's irrelevant because we're in a situation where, in a sport where safety is a big problem, that woman didn't feel safe, and that's shocking. I don't think we know whether this person, Khalif, was born male or female. The International Boxing Association have put out a statement suggesting that they have XY chromosomes, so male. Testosterone levels don't make any difference. You know, that's not what separates male and female bodies. It's one of the things, but it's not the main difference. So I think no one knows the truth here except those boxers who were in the ring. Maybe the IOC know, but this is their policy. This is their policy in action. They've said no presumed advantage. And this is the result, is we're seeing a woman having to give up the most important, perhaps the most important opportunity of her career for her own safety. People are upset, but this is being played out, you know, in many sports.
Yes, this isn't about natural variations in testosterone level that would naturally occur within females. This is about somebody who has a very, very distinct biological advantages. The reason why the International Boxing Association has actually has ruled that that this individual and another individual are not eligible to compete against women. So, you know, she obviously would have known going into the ring that she's competing against this person, but presumably she felt this is just simply not safe for me. I'm going to have to step back in order to quite literally fight another day, because in a sport like boxing, you could end up with a fatality.
Yes, and just to come back to your point about testosterone levels, the IOC spokesman, Mark Adams, this morning said in a press conference that women can be in the range of male testosterone, that some women do have male levels of testosterone. I'm afraid that's just not correct. You know, if someone had an adrenal tumor, so they were very ill, they might be producing that level of testosterone, but they're not going to be at the Olympics. Even women with polycystic ovary syndrome, which is something that can enable you to still do sport but raise testosterone levels in women, they don't approach the levels of men. So that's absolute nonsense. It's deliberate obfuscation. This person has male advantage, and it's not just one thing. It's dozens and dozens of things that mean that they don't belong in female sport. And, you know, when people talk about, you know, Adams this morning said, let's not go back to the bad old days of sex testing. Well, those were the good old days, because you could have one cheek swab in your life and then have a certificate that said what sex you were. There's nothing intrusive about that.
And yet the German Democratic Republic did have a lot of women of questionable levels of testosterone competing in various Olympic Games throughout the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, but you know what? They never reached male levels. And, you know, if they'd known that all they had to do was change their passports, take a few men to change their passports and say they were women, it would have saved the health of those poor women who were doped by the East German regime. So all the surveys have shown that elite athletes would much rather have sex testing than face situations like this.
Fiona McEnana, we're going to have to leave it there. We're going to head straight to Southport Court. The 17-year-old male charged with the murder of 3 girls killed in Southport has now been named as Axel Ruda-Cabana after he appeared before Liverpool's Crown Court. Charlie Peters, our national reporter, has been there in the courtroom. Charlie, what went on?
Well, there were 2 different court hearings today, Tom. First in the youth court, which was then moved on to the Crown Court for the second hearing, where Axel Ruda-Cabana was named and the reporting restrictions on his identity were lifted because he turns 18 in just 6 days. And the judge here said that the principal interest for lifting that restriction was that he would soon reach his majority and therefore would have all those restrictions lifted regardless. He also pointed towards much of the unrest that we've seen taking place across the country in recent days, rioting last night, not only in London but also in Hartlepool and Manchester. The judge here saying, Mr. Justice Minari Casey, saying that at least part of that rioting had been inspired by a vacuum of the facts where false information was being spread. He said this was nonsense and it needed to be challenged with the truth. Well, the truth is now that the suspect in this case, alleged to have committed committed 3 murders and 10 attempted murders and possession of an offensive sharp blade is Axel Rudakabana, a 17-year-old, again turning 18 in just 6 days. He was arrested at the scene on Monday, shortly after calls were made at 11:50 of that mass stabbing attack at the location on Hart Street, where a Taylor Swift yoga dance event was taking place. We also heard both names of the adults who have survived the alleged attack, saying that they are Leanne Lucas, who was leading the dance class, and a local called John Hayes. All 8 of the remaining attempted murder charges relate to children. Their names are protected by law at this stage. But as discussed, Axel Rudakabana, 17-year-old, has been named as the suspect in this case. And sitting in the courtroom in the first lower court in the magistrates, he was silent, but he smiled towards the press gallery behind the dock as he entered the court, and then covered his face with his grey jumper tracksuit. In the Crown Court, he entered without gazing towards us, again covering his face with a tracksuit, rocking gently side to side as he heard deliberations between the defending and prosecuting barristers and the judge about these reporting restrictions and upcoming dates for these legal proceedings. But when I think he realised perhaps that he was going to be named and reporting restrictions were to be lifted, he then stopped rocking and indeed appeared to gaze below the cover he'd made for himself through his tracksuit and look around the courtroom. Now, the next date for these proceedings will be the 25th of October, when a plea date has been put into the legal diary. Until then, he will be remanded in youth custody in a secure facility.
Ordinary words there, Charlie. The way that he looked up at the press gallery and smiled. Beggars belief, but goodness me, the trial continues. Charlie Peters, thank you very much for joining us live from Liverpool Crown Court. Now, much more to come after this.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg's State of the Nation, Monday to Thursday from 8 p.m.
Well, I'm joined now by royal biographer and former royal photographer, Ian Lloyd. Ian,
hello, Jacob.
Thank you
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for joining me. This is going to be great, isn't it? The opportunity to go around and see where the King comes onto the balcony from. Really interesting insight to how Buckingham Palace works.
It's exciting. I went yesterday, there was a press preview, and the thing that struck me first of all is that if you're the King and or the late Queen and you're on the balcony, you can't see the Mall. I mean, we all see people coming down from the top, thousands of people crowding in towards Buckingham Palace. They can't see it because of this great monument to Queen Victoria called the Queen Victoria Memorial, or they call it the wedding cake, but it blocks the view. So apparently the King has a TV in there. And the late Queen did as well. So what they do is they when they're waiting to come on, they're watching the TV to see how the crowd's getting nearer the palace. And the other thing that struck me is when we were on it looking down, is you can actually see individual faces in the crowd out there, because we looked out, So they do get a good view of what's happening directly underneath the palace,
So they can see individuals. So if there's a friendly face in the crowd, they can see that person and possibly even wave. But they can't see that enormous mass of people you get at the big events that goes back towards Admiralty Arch.
The other thing I learned is there's a great historical link, because the person that put the east wing on the palace, because it was originally 3 sides, and Queen Victoria had, of course, 9 children, so they had to build a 4th side for all the nurseries and things. Edward Blord was the architect, but the master builder was Thomas Cubitt.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
As time passes,
She could have said stump.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
something practical could be done.
I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 10 to 1.
Ew, it's Yorkshire Day, the annual awareness day. It's Yorkshire Day, the annual awareness day, promoting the UK's largest ceremonial county as a good place to be born, live, to work and to visit.
And I promise I won't try a Yorkshire accent, at least not yet. Well, it all marks the anniversary of the 1759 Battle of Minden, in which the King's own Yorkshire Light Infantry fought with the Hanoverians, the Hessians and the Prussians to beat a combined force of France and Saxony during the 7 Years' War.
Well, joining us now is GB News Yorkshire and Humber reporter Anna Riley. Anna, how did we do with the accents there? I say we, me, because Tom betrayed me and didn't do one too.
Happy Yorkshire Day. It was certainly entertaining, I'll give you that. A good try, certainly. How's that doing? And A-up and happy Yorkshire Day. As you can see now, the room that we're in is just filling up. We're currently at the Citadel, the home of York City Church, and you can see all the flags around. Of course, Yorkshire's got its own flag, but this meal today, this afternoon, is all about highlighting the diversity that we have in Yorkshire, all the different countries there represented on the flags. And as you can see, the people that are walking in, these are all dignitaries. So this has been a special service today in York. It started back in 1985. It was something created by the Yorkshire Society. They decided every year on the 1st of August for Yorkshire Day, a different town or city in God's own country, in Yorkshire, would host Yorkshire Day for civic dignitaries, and there's over 120 mayors from all across the region that have come out for Yorkshire Day. So that's who you can see there in the background as they're having their food. And Yorkshire Day, it's all about celebrating the culture of Yorkshire. We've got our own dialect, our own language, as we were speaking to earlier when you came to me. We've got our own foods. We're very proud. We're a nation within a nation, you could call it. And Yorkshire Day is all about having that pride. And it's not just people from Yorkshire that celebrate it. People have come here to York from all over the world. I spoke to Joe Lunn earlier. He's a delegate for the Yorkshire Society. He lives in Australia, and he's actually wanting to make Yorkshire Day a national, if not a worldwide holiday. This is what he had to say.
I suddenly got the idea from St Patrick's Day. I thought, why can't we have Yorkshire Day as big as St Patrick's Day worldwide, or even Australia-wide? And that's my mission.
What is it that you love so much about this fine county we've got?
Oh, it's too hard to say, but I'm 88 years old, and I go back to when we used to sleep not only 5 in a bed, but we used to sleep 11 in a space, not even a bed, just on the floor, no blankets, no sheets, no pillows, just 4 or 5 World War I army greatcoats and just cuddling one another. That's how far back I go. So them memories are brilliant, you know. I mean, I'd love for things not to have changed. Lovely little village. Everybody were honest. We had very little crime in our village. If any, I can't even remember any. So that's what I like about Yorkshire.
so fantastic there to hear from Joe. 88 years old, he left Yorkshire. He was from Rothwell, West Yorkshire. He left over 58 years ago, had children over in Australia, and he was telling me how he's still, as you'll have heard him there, he's kept his Yorkshire accent. He said he asked his young daughter, who was born in Australia, go get me a glass of water, and she said to him, Dad, it's water. So it's just brilliant, and who knows, could we have a national holiday for Yorkshire Day? Certainly people in this county will support it, and it's a fantastic day. This is what's happening now behind us with this civic lunch has rounded off a fantastic day. This morning it all started in the Guild Hall, which is where the council host a lot of their services, and it's a place where kings from centuries back visited, a very historical place. Then we saw a parade through York of all these mayors that you can see here, down to the Minster, York Minster, a fantastic building. And now they've had the service at the Minster, and now they're having the food. Let's hope there's some Yorkshire puddings on the menu.
Now, it is marvellous. Yorkshire, of all the counties of England, probably has the strongest identity, the strongest sense of civic...
I think Northumbria might disagree with you there, with their own flag. Although I loved his white rose of York they had on his lapel there. I love a bit of the local patriotism.
No, it's absolutely tremendous. And I did enjoy your Yorkshire accent as well. Anna, I suppose...
Thanks, Tom.
I will have to... We'll be back with Anna next hour, and perhaps...
It's going to be Tom's turn.
Perhaps I might have to try a Yorkshire accent. That's something to stick around for, isn't it?
You let me down.
But it's not just Yorkshire. We're going to be back, of course, outside Liverpool Crown Court as the 17-year-old Southport stabbing suspect is named as Axel Rudakubana. That's Axel Rudakubana. Reporting restrictions have now been lifted on the identity of this suspect because he turns 18 in just 6 days' time. We're going to be back outside that court with all of the details after this.
Celebrate a spectacular summer with your chance to win an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash in our Great British Giveaway. It's the biggest prize of the year so far, and it's totally tax-free. What would you spend that on? Luxury holidays, a new car, or just put it away for a rainy day? Whatever you do with £30,000 in tax-free cash, make sure you don't miss out on a chance to make it yours. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text CASH to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
A new report suggests that Prince Harry is lonely in California and he's considering returning to Britain despite a seismic falling out with his father and his brother.
But the question we're asking this morning is whether Meghan would come with her Prince Charming or whether Harry would perhaps be more welcome here if he came solo.
Like Kinsey, we'll go to Kinsey Schofield live now in LA. Kinsey, we've got lots of time to talk about this and speculate this. We've got about 6 minutes or so to talk. But what's behind all of this? Where are these thoughts coming from?
They're coming from royal author Huw Edwards, and I don't know if you're familiar with Mr. Vickers, but he's written over 30 books about the British royal family. And he told The Sun that Prince Harry will ultimately return to the UK with his tail between his legs. He described the Duke of Sussex as angry and says Harry is genuinely petrified of losing his wife, Meghan Markle. When asked his predictions for where Harry and Meghan will be in the next 20 years, Vickers told The Sun, I think he'll come home, explaining, I think Harry will come home, and if he comes home, we must be very nice to him because he won't particularly want to. He's quite angry, suggesting that he would be coming home solo. Vickers also said that Prince Harry looks slightly petrified of Meghan Markle and that King Charles has left the door wide open for Harry's return if and when he does decide to come back.
I can only imagine the culture shock that Prince Harry has faced arriving there. This is a kid that has grown up in castles.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 1 o'clock on Thursday, the 1st of August. I'm Emma Webb.
And I'm Tom Harwood.
Southport stabbings. The suspect is named as Axel Rudakabana. Appearing in Liverpool Crown Court, the 17-year-old is charged with 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder and possession of a bladed article. We're live from the court.
Disorder across Britain. The Prime Minister will meet with police chiefs after rioters flood the streets of Southport, Hartlepool, Manchester and London. As violence and anger simmer across our communities, we ask, where is law and order? We'll be live on Downing Street.
And a Braverman exclusive. In just a moment, we'll be bringing you a Suella Braverman interview. The former Home Secretary sits down with GB News political editor Chris Hope, answering big questions, including why she didn't stand in the Tory leadership race and whether she will defect to reform.
And the BBC is under fire for continuing to pay Huw Edwards hundreds of thousands of pounds in licence fee money after they knew he was arrested on serious grounds. This as the Culture Secretary summons the BBC's boss for a dressing down. Who knew what and when? Now, throughout, please do send your thoughts, post your comments, visit us at gbnews.com/your say. It feels that normally in August, doing news, you get to the less serious stories. It's more frivolous, it's more silly. This feels anything but.
There's so many big stories coming out this week. I mean, it just seems to be relentless, and so many of them so absolutely horrendous. Like I say, seems relentless. It's like an avalanche of really enormous stories. So many people must be on their holidays thinking, what on earth is going on back at home?
And it really does feel that the United Kingdom is now this sort of tinderbox. We've seen the disorder across so many major cities, and I suppose one of the reasons why the Prime Minister has called police chiefs to Downing Street for this meeting is that they don't expect that last night was the end of it. I mean, it could have just been the start.
I mean, they're obviously worried that this is something that's going to spiral and escalate across the country. Perhaps they're aware that they've not handled it as well as they could have done. And as Charlie Peters was saying there, Axel Rudakabana, the suspect who's been charged now with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, he has been named just short of 6 days short of his 18th birthday, partly because of this vacuum of information that was so frustrating to so many people who are absolutely justified in their anger.
Well, goodness me, we will be live outside that court with Charlie Peters after your headlines with Sophia.
Tom, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 3 minutes past 1. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. To recap on that breaking news, a 17-year-old boy accused of murdering 3 young girls in Southport has now been named as Axel Rudakabana. 3 children, 7-year-old Elsie Stankoom, Alice Aguiar, who was 9, and 6-year-old BB King, were killed during the attack at a holiday club. He can now be named after a judge lifted reporting restrictions, though he was due to lose his right to anonymity anyway when he turns 18 next week. He's been remanded in youth detention accommodation after appearing at Liverpool Crown Court this morning. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister will meet police leaders today amid widespread protests following Monday's attack. Angry crowds took to the streets of Manchester, Hartlepool and London, with some declaring their support for Tommy Robinson, saying, "We want our country back." It's after social media posts falsely claimed the suspect was a Muslim asylum seeker who'd crossed the Channel in a small boat. Cars were set alight on fire in Hartlepool, while flares and bottles were thrown at a statue of Winston Churchill in London's Parliament Square. More than 100 people were arrested in the capital, while Cleveland police made 8 arrests, with more expected. The Bank of England has cut its base interest rate to 5%, marking the first reduction since March 2020. The rate had been held at 5.25% since August last year, which was the highest level since 2008. It comes as new data suggests the cost of living crisis is easing, thanks to inflation cooling off. The Culture Secretary will meet the head of the BBC today after it emerged Huw Edwards continued to be employed even after he was arrested on suspicion of serious offences. It comes after it was revealed that the former news presenter was arrested in November but continued to be employed until April. In a statement, the BBC said that at that time, no charges had been brought against Mr Edwards, and it was also aware of a significant risk to his health. He pleaded guilty yesterday to charges relating to receiving indecent images of children during an online chat. Former BBC executive Roger Bolton told us that many questions remain.
It's absolutely clear that BBC News and all the editors involved did not know until this week that Huw Edwards had been charged, let alone what he'd been charged with. And clearly, if you've watched all the reporting and reading the website of the BBC News has been reporting this top item, not hiding anything. However, the big questions remain about, we now know that the BBC executives were told in confidence that Huw Edwards had been arrested. When did they know he was charged? And the big question over all of this is, why did they continue to pay him so much money in these circumstances?
Now, in other news, GPs in England have voted to limit the number of appointments available in their first collective action since 1964. NHS England says it could cause significant disruption across the whole health service. The British Medical Association says it's taking action over what it describes as a lack of funding for GPs. It comes despite the Health Secretary warning that while the previous government failed to recruit enough doctors, reducing services would only punish patients. Tensions are rising in the Middle East as Iran orders retaliatory strikes on Israel following the death of a top Hamas leader. Thousands turned out for the funeral of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, who was the terror group's most senior political chief. He was killed during a strike on the Iranian capital this week, which immediately raised fears of broader escalation in the region. Both Britain's foreign and defence secretaries are in Qatar for talks aimed at quelling the tensions. Back in the UK, 7 Just Stop Oil protesters have been arrested after blocking the passenger search area at Heathrow's Terminal 5. The group were seen holding signs saying oil kills and sign the treaty in front of the barriers to the area for departing passengers. Both the Met Police and Heathrow said minimal disruption was caused. It comes after a protest on Tuesday that saw 2 activists arrested after they splattered orange paint throughout the terminal. And just when you thought it was time to enjoy summer, thunderstorms are expected to hit at any moment now. Yellow warnings are in place for much of England and Wales as the heatwave continues, but heavy showers, lightning and thunder will break the hot spell soon, with travel disruption and power cuts possible. Flood alerts are also in place in parts of the Midlands. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 8 minutes past 1.
Now to our lead story. The 17-year-old male charged with the murder of 3 girls killed in Southport has been named as Axel Rudikabana after he appeared before Liverpool's Crown Court earlier this afternoon.
Elsie Stankham, Alice Agua and Bebe King, pictured there, died after a mass stabbing at a dance session on Hart Street on Monday. The teenager has also been charged with 10 counts of attempted murder and the possession of a bladed article. He's now been remanded into youth custody.
Well, explaining his choice to lift reporting restrictions on the case, Andrew Menery, KC, said, Whilst I accept it is exceptional given his age, principally because he is 18 in 6 days' time, I do not make an order under Section 45, continuing to prevent the full reporting that has the disadvantage of allowing others to spread misinformation in a vacuum. That was the judge there setting out his explanation for lifting these reporting restrictions.
Joining us now live from Liverpool Crown Court is GB News national reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, what's the latest?
Well, yes, 30 minutes ago, the judge, Mr. Justice Menery, did lift those reporting restrictions on Axel Rudakabana, the 17-year-old suspect in those 3 murders and 10 attempted murders in Southport in a mass stabbing attack on Monday. And he lifted them principally due to the fact that he is turning 18 in just 6 days' time. But he heard competing legal arguments from both counsel prosecuting the case, but also from the media, who made a request to lift that restriction because he had to balance the concerns for the suspect's welfare and the suspect's family's welfare with also the concern about public interest, about filling an information vacuum, which the press said had helped to spark so many of the protests that we have seen since Tuesday evening when rioting hit Southport. We also saw protests last night in Manchester, in Hartlepool and in London, and also in Aldershot, with concerns raised that more rioting could occur and more unrest later this week. Our Home Affairs and Security Editor Mark White has said that while this misinformation that's been spread about the case has sparked some of the protests, there is also widespread anger more generally about things in Britain. Tom, you referred to Britain being a tinderbox, and these mass stabbings could have sparked a more broader disenchantment and anger in Britain. But here in the courtroom, Axel Rudakabana was named, and when he was receiving those charges, he did not confirm his name, and he did not look towards the judge, Mr. Justice Menery, as he gave his judgment. The next plea hearing date will be the 25th of October. Axel Rudakabana will be remanded in youth custody until then. And I'm going to just move us away from Liverpool a moment and look back to Southport, because there is some good news, which is from Alderhay Children's Hospital, who've said that they are delighted that 2 of the children involved in Monday's awful incident have now been discharged. They went on to say, we continue to treat 5 children involved in the devastating incident in Southport on Monday, including one recently transferred to us from Aintree University Hospital. All of the children in our care are currently in a stable condition. So that is some welcome news in Merseyside as the region recovers and reels from what was an appalling incident on Monday, as the lead suspect in that case charged with 3 murders and 10 attempted murders and possession of a bladed item.
Charlie, it is the most extraordinary story. You describe the suspect walking in. Earlier you said he was smiling as he looked up to you in the press gallery. Tell us about the demeanour of Axel Rudakabana as he was there in court, hearing what would happen.
Well, in the lower court, the room was so full the district judge actually asked some people in the courtroom to leave, such as the attention in this case, the amount of press here to attend, which meant that both the press gallery inside the court and a more public space were filled with journalists. And sat behind the dock, as he walked into the court, he smirked towards the press sat behind where I was sat. But then for the rest of the proceeding in the lower court, kept a tracksuit over his face, covering himself with his grey jumper, his eyes and his ears during proceedings, and not looking towards the district judge. The same act was repeated in the Crown Court, where he regularly covered his ears and his eyes. In any difference there was in the Crown Court, he was seen rocking side to side during the lengthier hearing, 20 minutes in the Crown Court, just 5 minutes in the lower magistrates this morning. But during that Crown Court hearing, that rocking seemed to stop as the judge addressed him and notified that the reporting restriction on his identity would be lifted. He was emotionless throughout and left the court when told to do so. He can access the plea hearing on the 25th of October by remote video link while he is remanded in secure unit in youth custody until then.
It is a very interesting point that the judge in this case has said that the vacuum, the information vacuum, has been sparking this unrest, or indeed the decision to name this suspect is an attempt almost to quell some of that unrest. I suppose that's an admission from the authorities.
Well, it's understood that the police did not want to have him named and the reporting restrictions lifted because they think it would not actually quell the unrest or fill the information vacuum. But that's the case that the press put forward, which was listened to and agreed with by the judge, Mr. Justice Menery, today. It does seem that many of the protesters are more broadly angry about the state of Britain in the so-called Enough is Enough protest in Downing Street. They've been derided in a blanket way as far right by many commentators, but I think lots of them actually are agitated by the fact that a mass stabbing of children could take place and are extremely angry about it. So there is potentially a perspective to be seen from the police view on this case, which is that the truth with regard to the suspect's identity won't actually reduce the protest. We'll only be able to see in the coming days if that was the right call. But certainly there was a view in the court from the press that doing so would fill the misinformation vacuum. Because Tom and Emma, we've seen so many false theories catch on like wildfire this week since this appalling incident on Monday. And for the community, I was in Southport last night and this morning, traumatised not only by that appalling incident, but also by the rioting and speculation that they felt had fueled it. Speculation that listed the attacker as an Islamist, despite no evidence pointing to that whatsoever. But now the suspect has been named as 17-year-old Axel Rudekabana.
And thank God that those two children have been released from hospital. Thank you. That was Charlie Peters there, our national reporter. Now we can speak to our Home and Security editor, Mark White, apologies there, about the latest on this from Downing Street.
Mark, good to see you. Of course, Keir Starmer. Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, I was just saying that we are expecting a meeting taking place here in Downing Street this afternoon, which will be chaired by the Prime Minister and also include the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper with senior policing leaders as they look at how best to respond to what might be a potentially worrying time ahead. We have now seen a second night in which disorder that started in Southport has spread to a number of other areas of the country, and the real concern going forward is that it might have the potential to spread even further, to become even more intense. Sometimes these events and this kind of disorder can have a momentum of its own, and it can just propel and instigate other acts of disorder. We saw it back in 2011 with the London riots that took place initially in Tottenham but spread right across London and then to many other parts of England as well. So some real concern, and that's why these policing leaders are here. They will be looking at the resilience of police forces across the country, at what they call mutual aid. That's the ability of other police forces to be able to moment's notice to muster up resources to help a neighbouring force out if they're dealing with significant disorder. So those kind of plans will be looked at as they go forward here. The hope always being that things will start to calm down, but they've got to plan for the worst case scenario.
Well, Mark White, Home and Security Editor, really appreciate your words there live on Downing Street. We'll be back with you next hour. Now, coming up, former Home Secretary Suella Braverman is in an exclusive interview with our political editor after this.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm joined now by Stefan Kyriasis to give us the latest on everything theatre.
So, yeah, we're going in first with Starlight Express, which is back. It's not in the West End. It's out at Wembley at the Troubadour Theatre, which is a big, almost kind of warehouse space, which suits because, as you know, have you seen the show?
Starlight Express was my first ever musical. I must have been about 7 or 8 years old. I only saw it once, but I remember it being magical.
Well, this one, it's 1984 it started, and it's still running in Bochum in Germany in a huge arena. So basically what we've got, They've slightly tweaked it, and it's a little boy or little girl, depending on the cast, going to bed, obsessed with toy trains and dreaming of trains. Everybody is dressed up. To me, it looks like a cross between Tron and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. I don't really think any of them look remotely like a train, but hey, the songs are Andrew Lloyd Webber. It's pop mixed with kind of cod 1950s rock and roll, some power ballads. The lyrics are politely like something out of an old speak and spell machine or something. You know, he's a steam train, they're out of date, he's being bullied by the diesel and the electric, and he falls for this carriage, the first-class carriage, new girl Pearl, and he wants to impress her, so he enters a race, and that's pretty much it. And when the races happen, all these barriers come up around where we're sitting, the lights are flashing, the music's thumping. It's utterly ridiculous, and I felt like a kind of teenager that was huffing sherbet dib-dabs off a giant block of sugar. It's so much fun, and the really crucial thing about it all is that somehow, in the middle of all of that, I just felt myself getting into the story. And when Pearl and Rusty have their little duet, I was very moved. And there's this big starlight sequence, which is the inspiration, the magical starlight that he's seeking. It's beautiful.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking, this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. They catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 22 minutes past 1.
Now to an exclusive interview with the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. She sat down with GB News political editor Christopher Hope for his podcast and asked about a range of topics, including why she didn't stand in the leadership contest and whether she might defect to Reform UK. Let's take a listen to this exclusive interview.
How did you feel when you announced this week you weren't going to stand to be Tory party leader?
I guess, in one word, sorry. You know, I did have a lot of support from members of the party.
You had 10 members, MPs, to back you?
10 MPs who had, prepared to sign my nomination form to get on the ballot. So I was sorry to them because they, decided to back me. I was sorry to the thousands of Tory members who had written to me in recent weeks urging me to go forward.
Thousands?
For the leadership.
Thousands,
yes, absolutely. But, I have to read the runes. In Parliament. I didn't have the support to proceed. And so, it's better for everybody.
Do you think you got unfairly judged in your time? I mean, you're a very relaxed, friendly person I've met over the years, but that's not the public persona, is it?
Listen, I think it comes with the territory of politics. I'm a conviction politician. I'm someone who, I see this role not just as a means to rise up the greasy pole. I do see it as a way to actually try and speak the truth on behalf of the British people, to the British people, for the British people. And sometimes those truths are really difficult to hear in the Westminster bubble, amongst the kind of elites, amongst some of my colleagues. 2 years ago, I was the first cabinet member to publicly call for us to leave the European Convention of Human Rights. I was demonised then. People said I was mad and crazy for saying that. 2 years on, we've got, so-called one nation candidates in the leadership contest, like Tom Tugendhat, leading with a pledge to potentially leave the European
He
Convention.
hasn't gone further than Rishi Sunak. I mean, look at the wording there.
He's done it in very caveated wording, but I thought that was quite telling that someone from the One Nation wing of the Conservative Party would even want to embrace that subject. But I think the fact that he has chosen that subject,
you've changed the weather
something
on that.
to talk about, is a reflection of how we've moved the debate and shifted the Overton window. When I said multiculturalism wasn't working last year, I did so because it was the important thing to describe and observe in our country. Again, none of the members of the cabinet backed me up and I was shunned. But, 6 months on, a lot of people I think would agree with that analysis. When I said that the police were being too soft on the pro-Palestinian protesters, I lost my job for it.
That was the opinion piece that appeared in one of the newspapers, the Telegraph.
Yes, it was the right thing to do because the police had to step up and be more robust with, anti-Semitism and racism running rife on our streets. I am someone who I acknowledge that I will try and break new ground by saying some of these things. It doesn't do me any favours and, I put my head above the parapet and I get shot down. But it does make it easier for others to come in afterwards and say things in a similar way.
You're the pioneer, are you?
Well, I wouldn't say that myself.
Okay.
That's your word. But I mean, and if that's my role...
Yeah.
I will keep fulfilling that role because I think these debates are really important to have. And, if we can start these conversations and then thereafter change policy and direction of our party and therefore our country, then I think that's an important role to be had.
Have you given up on ever leading the party again?
I'm
you and me talking. No one's listening to this.
No one's listening, are they? No, I won't put myself forward again. I'm very happy. I've had a go and, I am here to support. I'm passionate about Conservative revival. Yeah. And you're right, I do come to politics with a bit of heart and soul. It gets me into trouble sometimes, I admit, but I'm trying to speak in an authentic voice that people understand.
But they respond to that. I've seen it at the Tory Party conference. When you speak to them, they love it. They love it.
And I love speaking like that, and I want to, and I do it because I have a deep and profound love of my country and the British people.
But so you won't ever stand again for Tory leadership. Is that because you get one chance really at that? I mean, look at Jeremy Hunt. He's had, I think, 2 or 3 goes, but with declining returns.
Listen, I very much hope the leader we choose stays in post for a very long time. We do tend to chop and change, and I think we've done that with too much frequency in recent years, which is one of the reasons the electorate got fed up with us. Let's have some stability. Let's allow someone to bed in and let their agenda
and work out what it is.
And let's give it a good go. But no, that will be it from me, I think.
And what's next for you? There's talk about reform. Would you ever join reform?
I'm not going to defect to reform, no. And I hope I'm not driven out to reform by my colleagues. Listen, I look at Lee Anderson. Lee Anderson is a good friend of mine, and it's a tragedy that we lost him to reform. He's someone who speaks with an authentic voice that resonates with a lot of people in Britain. And, he's someone who is very brave, incredibly dedicated, and that we lost him, that our Conservative Party could not be the broad church. We talk about our broad church. Well, we weren't broad enough for Lee Anderson. Lee Anderson should be sitting as a Conservative Member of Parliament. In fact, we should have more Conservative Members of Parliament because reform should not have been the force that it was. And many of our MPs lost because of reform. So we talk about a broad church. We should not be hounding out Conservatives, right-wingers, Eurosceptics, people who want to stand up for our flag and our faith, and as if they are somehow swiveled-eyed loons, which is the term that David Cameron, I think, used many years ago.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
I'm not sure he ever say he did use that term.
Fair enough, allegedly. Lee Anderson should be a Conservative MP.
Just looking forward to the 2029 election, how many MPs do you think reform could end up with if the Tory party doesn't change course?
I am absolutely confident that reform can do better.
Dozens of MPs?
It's very hard to put a number on it, but look, they came second in many, many places. That
98 or 90 or so.
Right, that's a high number of seats where they came second. That should alarm the Conservatives. They came second in a lot of Labour-held seats now, so that they are eating into the Labour vote. They took more of the under 30 vote than we did. So for young people are voting more for reform than they are for the Conservatives. These facts alone should, seriously alarm any Conservative leader and all Conservative MPs. I'm just concerned that there's still a level of complacency and
Is it time to bring Nigel Farage into the party, into your party?
Listen, I don't know what form it would take, but then the fact is that there is not enough room in British politics for two Conservative parties. Reform and the Conservatives cannot coexist in the way that they are. We will have no chance of winning the next general election as long as Reform is a viable alternative.
So they've got to merge the two parties.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. As I said, I don't know what form it should take, but we cannot even consider ourselves as a viable government in waiting as long as Reform is a force to be reckoned with.
Well, that was Christopher Hope, our political editor, speaking to the former Home Secretary, someone who was considered that she might run for the leadership and then didn't. Christopher Hope joins us now, live from Westminster. Christopher, what were your main takeaways from your interview?
Hi, Tom. Hi, Emma. Yeah, I think this is interesting. I mean, of course, we know that she had the support, she says so, Suella Braverman, to stand, but that she pulled out on Sunday night. This is the only interview she's giving anywhere since issuing that statement through the Daily Telegraph. She's given it to GB News. I think she's giving a challenge here to the Tory party. Does it go towards the middle ground where it thinks Labour is, or does it try to mop up disaffected support in the Reform UK party? And I think that's where she is clearly saying to the 6 candidates to replace Rishi Sunak, you've got to go after Reform UK. You can't have a split right-wing vote going into the 2029 general election. She's saying, work out how to appeal to those people, and she would say that's committing to withdraw in part or in full from the European Convention on Human Rights, being tougher on immigration, being a low-tax party. That is the Suella Braverman demands she wants to see fulfilled by the next leader of the party. And it's a challenge, really, to those who might follow Mr Sunak. Do they go after the middle ground, where they get squeezed maybe by the Liberal Democrats and Labour, who are now quite strong in areas where the Tories were strong before last month's general election? Or do they try and deal with the Reform UK threat? She said in terms there that Lee Anderson should be a Tory MP. He was badly managed by the whips in the last Parliament. But she says there's no way back, she thinks, for Nigel Farage. And she says she won't join Reform unless she's forced out by her own party. And that's the challenge, I think, for these right-wing Tory MPs.
Chris, Reform isn't going to go anywhere. In fact, if anything, the fact that they managed to win 5 MPs is quite extraordinary given the first-past-the-post system. And obviously Suella Braverman knows that. And given her analysis of the challenges that we face, as well as the challenges within the Conservative Party, she doesn't seem particularly optimistic about the Conservative Party. So how can she see her future in politics, all of those things considered?
I mean, she's really saying, I don't want to join Reform UK. I'm not joining them. But the caveat is, unless I'm pushed out by my colleagues. The problem that Tory rights have is there are very few right-wing Tory MPs left. I think the European Research Group of Tory MPs, the officers of that group, met last Monday. There were 3 members of it. There's Suella Braverman, of course, Mark Francois. There's Ian Duncan-Smith, Dane Priti Patel, and Andy Rosendale. That is the rump of the Tory right wing, because the party is mainly based in the south. It's quite centrist. And the concern is going to be, going into this 3-month-long leadership campaign, is that the party might put up 2 quite centrist candidates for the membership, but the membership remains quite right-wing, and they want to work out who is this right-winger who we can support, and are we going to be offered up basically almost Liberal Democrat-type policies for a party which is, its membership base is quite right-wing. That is the challenge, I think, facing this party.
OK, well, Christopher Hope, thank you very much for joining us. And indeed, the rest of your exclusive interview will be shown tonight at 8 o'clock on State of the Nation. And you can listen to the full interview on Chopper's Political Podcast, out tomorrow from 6 in the morning.
But coming up, we're back in Liverpool as the suspect is named as Axel Rudikabana. That's after your headlines with Sophia.
Emma, thank you. It's 1:33. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. We start with some breaking news. Reports suggest that Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is being released from a Russian prison as part of an exchange. The news, which was first reported by Bloomberg, means the journalist walks free after he was sentenced to 16 years in prison last month. Former US Marine Paul Whelan is also being released as part of the major multi-country deal. Both men were accused of espionage, which they deny. They're understood to be currently travelling to destinations outside of Russia. A 17-year-old boy accused of murdering 3 young girls in Southport has been named as Axel Rudakabana. 3 children, 7-year-old Elsie Stankum, Alice Aguiar, who was 9, and 6-year-old BB King were killed during the attack at a holiday club. He's been remanded in youth detention accommodation after appearing at Liverpool Crown Court this morning. Meanwhile, it was another night of violence across Britain last night, with angry crowds taking to the streets of Manchester, Hartlepool and London, encouraged by false social media posts regarding the Southport attack. Some declared their support for Tommy Robinson, saying, "We want our country back." More than 100 people were arrested in the capital, while Cleveland police made 8 arrests, with more expected. The Prime Minister is due to discuss the situation with police leaders today. The Bank of England has cut interest rates to 5%, making the first reduction since March 2020. The base rate had been held at 5.25% since August last year, which was the highest level since 2008. GPs in England have voted to limit the number of appointments available in their first collective action since 1964. The British Medical Association says it's taking action over what it describes as a lack of funding for GPs. The Culture Secretary will meet the head of the BBC today after it was revealed that former news presenter Huw Edwards was arrested in November but continued to be employed until April. He pleaded guilty yesterday to charges related to receiving indecent images of children during an online chat. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Cheers Britannia Wine Club proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
And here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2796 and 1.1860 euros. The price of gold is £1,909.44 per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 8,364 points.
Cheers Britannia Wine Club proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Hello, welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. It could be quite an impactful day today with torrential downpours, a risk of thunderstorms for many areas of England and Wales. Further north, it will be a drier day, but a change is on the way from Friday as these weather fronts will push in from the north and west, bringing some cloudier skies later on this afternoon to parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but it will brighten up for a time here. But it's further south across England and Wales where there's that risk of thunderstorms and the warning in force. We could see some very torrential downpours and localised impacts due to heavy rain and water on the roads. That could bring disruption to travel. So a humid feeling day as a result of that. Not everywhere is going to see these thunderstorms. You might get away with a fairly dry and sunny day. And actually, as I said, across parts of northern Scotland for this afternoon, it's going to brighten up for a time after a bit of a cloudier start this morning. But more rain is on the way throughout this evening. Across eastern areas of Scotland, risk of the odd shower, but some sunny spells, and it's a warmer day today here than yesterday. Parts of Northern Ireland as well, seeing a fine end to the day, but these thunderstorms across England and Wales will likely continue into this evening as it stays quite humid, so further disruption is likely into this evening and overnight. But it will slowly ease off overnight as that risk does fade away. So a fairly dry night to come once those thunderstorms do push away to the east for most of us, but across the north and west it is turning much wetter and windier overnight. For many of us, it's still staying quite humid and muggy, temperatures in the mid-teens as a minimum. But to start the day, there'll be plenty of brightness. So a brighter day, still that humid feel around, and that will allow some thunderstorms to break out potentially across eastern areas of England. But for most of us, a fairly dry day, or at least a start to the day, as we will see some wet and windy weather spread into parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland later on in the afternoon. But ahead of that, still feeling very warm in the sunshine. Bye-bye.
The latest GB News travel.
I'm John Vincent. Queues in Perth and Kinross for the M19 northbound at junction 12, the Broxton roundabout. Slow in Merseyside for the M62 westbound at junction 4 for Rocket. The M5 northbound in Worcestershire is blocked for a caravan fire between junction 8 for the M50 and 7 for Worcester. We're also seeing slow traffic on the southbound side, which was briefly stopped as well. Slow for the M40 northbound in Oxfordshire due to an earlier broken down vehicle just before junction 10, the Cherwell Valley services. Severe delays on the M25 anti-clockwise in Surrey, 4 lanes closed there for a car fire just after junction 13 for Staines. Queues on the M25 anti-clockwise in Kent due to an earlier traffic problem at junction 1A Dartford Tunnel. And also in Kent, it's slow on the M26 westbound at the intersection with the M25 at junction 5. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Afternoon, Britain. It is 20 to 2.
Now, the 17-year-old male charged with the murder of 3 girls killed in Southport has been named as Axel Rudakabana after he appeared before Liverpool's Crown Court. These are the very latest pictures of Axel Rudakabana in court earlier today. The court sketch showing a man with his head in his hands, unable to show his face. We were speaking to our reporter, Charlie Peters, a moment ago. He was there in the courtroom, spoke how Axel held his jumper up to cover almost all of his face except for his eyes.
And also that he was rocking back and forth when he was at the Magistrates' Court and then later at the Crown Court. So paints a bit of an image for so many people who have been deeply, deeply frustrated by the lack of information, that vacuum of information that the judge mentioned was the reason behind his decision to make this suspect's name public, just 6 days short of his 18th birthday.
But this, the official court sketch of the moment that 17-year-old Axel Rudakabana was hearing the next steps. Of course, the next hearing is on the 25th of October. And Axel Rudakabana was to turn 18, or is to turn 18, in just 6 days' time. Part of the reasoning that the judge gave in terms of naming this suspect, because it goes against convention that anyone under the age of 18 would be named at this stage at all.
Now, moving on to the latest on the Huw Edwards story, BBC Director General Tim Davie is to face tough questions from the government about what the corporation knew about the Huw Edwards case.
Well, that was after the veteran broadcaster admitted accessing indecent images to children. The corporation has said it knew of the veteran broadcaster's arrest on suspicion of serious offences in November, but continued employing him until April.
Does the latest scandal show that the broadcaster has a culture of cover-up? Well, we can now speak to former BBC producer, editor John Mayer. Is the BBC protecting its own?
Probably. I mean, look, I spent 45 years working for, writing about and broadcasting about the BBC. This is actually the worst crisis I can remember in that time, because normally the crises are confected by people like you and the right-wing press. This is a homemade crisis. The BBC has brought this on itself. You know, where's Tim Davie getting advice from? He's surrounded by management editorial consultants. He doesn't have a journalist in a senior position. He doesn't have a flat catcher. Most good BBC DGs have somebody who catches the flak. He doesn't have that. He obviously makes all the decisions himself. I mean, I think today that quite a few people should actually be fired, be put up against the wall and fired. Anybody from the commissioner at BBC Wales who turned down the first person right through to whoever's made the last decisions. You know, it was very simple, the answer. You suspended him once you knew about the charge. You suspended him, put the money into an escrow account and say, look, if you're found innocent, this is your money. If you're found guilty, it's our money. So instead of which, an awful lot of licence payer money has gone to Huw Edwards when he was under deep suspicion, and the BBC knew about it. You know, what are they playing about? You know, Tim Davie needs to be kicked around the room by Lisa Nandy today. You know, he has surrounded himself with people who don't seem to know what they're doing.
And John, this appears to be the tip of the iceberg. Already this morning in the newspapers, we're hearing some of the past behaviour of Huw Edwards alleged towards junior producers and what have been described as flirtatious messages. I mean, this stuff seems to have been a relatively open secret. No suggestion of illegality over that, but deeply inappropriate behaviour suggested between Huw Edwards, the most senior newsreader at the BBC, and some other employees.
Yeah, tapping up young boys. I mean, if you saw Newsnight a year ago, you saw that they actually alleged, they said firmly that there were people in the newsroom who he was sending flirtatious messages to. He didn't sue, the BBC didn't deny it. So obviously it's true. But, you know, look, this man is smaller than the BBC. The BBC should just have got rid of him once they knew he was about to be charged. Just let him loose. Not you know, let him resign in his own time. Not waste an awful lot of licence payers' money. Get rid of him. You know, because this is the BBC. This is not the Huw Edwards Corporation.
Yes, of course, he resigned, didn't he? He wasn't pushed. So thank you very much. That was former BBC producer and editor John Mayer. Now, we have a statement here from the BBC, which reads as follows. In November 2023, whilst Mr Edwards was suspended, the BBC, as his employer at the time, was made aware in confidence that he had been arrested on suspicion of serious offences and released on bail whilst the police continued their investigation. At the time, no charges had been brought against Mr Edwards, and the BBC had also been aware of significant risk to his mental health. The BBC is shocked to hear the details which have emerged in court today. There can be no place for such abhorrent behaviour, and our thoughts are with all those affected. Today we have learnt of the conclusion of the police process in the details as presented to the court.
If at any point during the period Mr Edwards was employed by the BBC he had been charged, the BBC had determined it would act immediately to dismiss him. In the end, at the point of charge, he was no longer an employee of the BBC. During this period, in the usual way, the BBC kept its corporate management of these issues separate from its independent editorial functions. That's the statement from the BBC released yesterday.
Now, coming up, we're back outside Liverpool Crown Court as Axel Rudakabana is named as the Southport stabbing suspect.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
We're joined now by GB News national reporter Charlie Peters, who is outside Buckingham Palace for us.
Well, let's start with the expenditure, shall we? From the last year, it was £89.1 million. That's what the royal household spent. And one of the core parts of that expenditure was, of course, their big event last May, the coronation. £800,000 went into that. And then we should look at the engagements. You mentioned the number that King Charles made last year. Well, £4.2 million on those engagements, much of that travel. And then finally, how much that costs us all? Well, it's £1.29 per person. That's the cost of the monarchy to the taxpayer. But that really hides the truth of how that cash comes about, because all of the money that the royal household spends is actually theirs being given back to them by the Treasury. It comes from the Crown Estate surplus. That's a £16 billion portfolio they have, and their sovereign grant is made up of the surplus from 2 years prior. So in the year to 2022, there was about £350 million knocking around from the surplus. That was given all to the Treasury, and they were given back 15% as their core sovereign grant. Additional 10% was given towards the resurfacing of Buckingham Palace. That's been going on since Parliament voted on it in 2017. It's expected to take 10 years. But all in all, that's been about £86.3 million. And as you heard, the expenditure was £89 million. So how do they mix that gap? How do they close that gap in and cost out? Well, they make their own money as well from additional sources of income. And that was the gates, the receipt to Windsor Castle and their many palaces across the country where people have paid about £10 million to visit in the last year.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent? I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 10 to 2.
New rules and safeguards over the ownership of XL bully dogs come into effect today in Scotland.
Well, these new rules will be similar to those introduced in England in December, which make it illegal to breed, sell, advertise, rehome or abandon an XL bully dog.
Joining us now for the latest is GB News Scotland reporter Tony Maguire in Ayrshire. Hi, Tony. Explain to us what's the latest on this story.
Good afternoon. Well, yes, today is that all-important American Bully XL law coming into force, which will prohibit owners from essentially selling, buying, but not owning the breed, which has been responsible for a huge number of recent attacks over the last few years. Now, I'm joined today by Lorraine Jardine, who owns the Islay Dog Rescue here in Ayrshire. Lorraine, thank you for joining me again. Tell me now, it's illegal at the current state for to rehome XL bullies, but you have had kind of crossings with them in the past, haven't you?
We have indeed. We've had several XL bullies over the years, some rehomed with great success and some with less success. So it has been a bit of a mixed bag.
And you know, one of the key parts over the last 6 months that we've seen after that law came into effect earlier in Wales and England were streams of people bringing up dogs from England and Wales to Scotland. Do you think that those actions have made the situation worse up here?
I think so, definitely. I know the Scottish Government chose not to bring the legislation in at the same time as the English Government, and whilst they weren't mocking the English Government in any way or you know, trying to be clever, I'm sure they were trying to take a more balanced approach to it. But unfortunately, what happened was that because they weren't unified, the people in England thought it was safe to ship their dogs up to a place where they weren't currently banned or weren't going to be banned. And it was actually, we saw it all arranged on social media. There were literally convoys of dogs coming up, people arranging to meet in lay-bys and service stations on the M6, flooding the country with these dogs and displacing them. So it's not good for the dogs. The dogs don't know where they're coming. Where they thought they were taking the dogs to, I don't know. So it's not good for the owners who are simply just offloaded their dogs. It's not good for the dogs. It was dangerous for them. And, you know, dog fighting rings, it was just a blessing.
And obviously for here now, it looks like over the next, you know, few days, there are, yesterday was that deadline for that all-important documentation, but any XL bullies still out there in Scotland, well, now they'll need to be muzzled in public, they'll need to be microchipped, they'll need to be neutered if applicable, and they will have had to get that new £92 licence or face up to a £5,000 fine.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for bringing us that story. Really extraordinary. I suppose people will be happy that there's been a greater alignment now between these rules, both north and south of the border. Tony Maguire in Ayrshire there for us.
They are cute when they're little.
They're not cute when they kill dogs.
They are when they're small.
People.
They're adorable when they're small.
Right, then they grow to £95 or £165, and they sort of rip things apart. I mean, they've got this sort of natural instinct because they've been bred to, you know, fight. They're fighting dogs.
Barking in the background there. It was quite a fearsome roar.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Scots will be happy that no longer people are sort of dumping the English dogs up in Scotland. But stay with us. We're live on Downing Street as police chiefs meet the Prime Minister following nights of violence across the country. We're live there after this. Don't go anywhere.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. It could be quite an impactful day today with torrential downpours, a risk of thunderstorms for many areas of England and Wales. Further north, it will be a drier day, but a change is on the way from Friday as these weather fronts will push in from the north and west, bringing some cloudier skies later on this afternoon to parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but it will brighten up for a time here. But it's further south across England and Wales where there's that risk of thunderstorms and the warning in force. We could see some very torrential downpours and localised impacts due to heavy rain and water on the roads. That could bring disruption to travel. So a humid feeling day as a result of that. Not everywhere's going to see these thunderstorms. You might get away with a fairly dry and sunny day. And actually, as I said, across parts of northern Scotland for this afternoon, it's going to brighten up for a time after a bit of a cloudier start this morning, but more rain is on the way throughout this evening. Across eastern areas of Scotland, risk of the odd shower, but some sunny spells, and it's a warmer day today here than yesterday. Parts of Northern Ireland as well seeing a fine end to the day, but these thunderstorms across England and Wales will likely continue into this evening as it stays quite humid, so further disruption is likely into this evening and overnight. But it will slowly ease off overnight as that risk does fade away. So a fairly dry night to come once those thunderstorms do push away to the east for most of us, but across the north and west it is turning much wetter and windier overnight. For many of us, it's still staying quite humid and muggy, temperatures in the mid-teens as a minimum. But to start the day, there'll be plenty of brightness. So a brighter day, still that humid feel around, and that will allow some thunderstorms to break out potentially across eastern areas of England. But for most of us, a fairly dry day, or at least a start to the day, as we will see some wet and windy weather spread into parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland later on in the afternoon. But ahead of that, still feeling very warm in the sunshine. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You really could become the next big Great British Giveaway winner with your chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash to spend on anything you like. Listen to what some of our previous winners have to say about winning big with us.
On the day that I got the money in the bank account, everything just seemed a lot sunnier.
But I do have something to spend it on.
Just go for it. It's an absolute must.
Thank you, GBNews.
Amazing feeling to win.
For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2 or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrants must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion, Mark Meets, and My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Let's go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan.
GB News royalty with
your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us. Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions.
that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return.
And a few surprises along the way.
Might be cold in this studio.
That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Thursday, the 1st of August. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Emma Webb.
Disorder across Britain. The Prime Minister will meet with police chiefs after rioters flood the streets of Southport, Hartlepool, Manchester and London. As violence and anger simmer across our communities, we ask, where is law and order? We're looking at live pictures of Downing Street and we'll be there shortly.
Southport stabbings. The suspect is named as Axel Rudakabana. Appearing in Liverpool Crown Court, the 17-year-old is charged with 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder and possession of a bladed article. We're live from the court shortly.
And the BBC is under fire for continuing to pay Huw Edwards hundreds of thousands of pounds in licence fee money after they knew he was arrested on serious grounds. This as the Culture Secretary summons the BBC's boss for a dressing down. Who knew what and when? There's a palpable sense of disorder across the country, and it's demonstrated by the fact that 3 weeks into this new government, the police chiefs are having to be called in to see the Prime Minister.
I mean, it really is astonishing. This week we've seen, I can barely remember all of the incidents of lawlessness. We've seen 3,000 migrants coming across on the small boats. We've seen various people brandishing machetes in the street in broad daylight, one on the back of a bus in Southend. We've seen riots spilling out across different parts of the country in response to the Southport stabbing. It's really just astonishing, and I think people are really worried, not only for their own safety, but for the safety of their families. And I think people are feeling frustrated and rightly very angry about this, and they want the government to respond properly and to make sure that Britain's streets are safe, because frankly, people just do not feel safe anymore.
Do you feel a sense of instability, of lawlessness, frankly of fear? Well, send us your views, post your comments by visiting gbnews.com/your say. That's the way to join the conversation. We'll get to all of those stories after your headlines with Sophia.
Tom, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 2 minutes past 2. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Your headlines. A 17-year-old boy accused of murdering 3 young girls in Southport has been named as Axel Rudakabana. 3 children, 7-year-old Elsie Stankum, Alice Aguiar, who was 9, and 6-year-old BB King, were killed during the attack at a holiday club. He's been remanded in youth detention accommodation after appearing at Liverpool Crown Court this morning. The Prime Minister will meet police leaders today amid widespread protests following Monday's attack. Angry crowds took to the streets of Manchester, Hartlepool and London, with some declaring their support for Tommy Robinson, saying, "We want our country back." It's after social media posts falsely claimed the attacker was a Muslim asylum seeker who'd crossed the channel in a small boat. Cars were set on fire in Hartlepool while flares and bottles were thrown at a statue of Winston Churchill in London's Parliament Square. More than 100 people were arrested in the capital, while Cleveland police made 8 arrests, with more expected. In other news, reports suggest that Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is being released from a Russian prison as part of an exchange. The news, which was first reported by Bloomberg, would see the journalist walk free after he was sentenced to 16 years in prison last month. Former US Marine Paul Whelan is also being released as part of the major multi-country deal. Both men were accused of espionage, which they deny. They're understood to be currently travelling to destinations outside of Russia. The Culture Secretary will meet the head of the BBC today after it emerged Huw Edwards continued to be employed even after he was arrested on suspicion of serious offences. It comes after it was revealed that the former news presenter was arrested in November but continued to be employed until April. In a statement, the BBC said that at the time, no charges had been brought against Mr. Edwards, and it was also aware of a significant risk to his health. He pleaded guilty yesterday to charges related to receiving indecent images of children during an online chat. Former BBC executive Roger Bolton told us that many questions remain.
It's absolutely clear that BBC News and all the editors involved did not know until this week that Huw Edwards had been charged, let alone what he'd been charged with. And clearly, if you've watched all the reporting and reading the website of the BBC News has been reporting this top item, not hiding anything. However, the big questions remain about, we now know that the BBC executives were told in confidence that Huw Edwards had been arrested. When did they know he was charged? And the big question over all of this is, why did they continue to pay him so much money in these circumstances?
Now, the Bank of England has cut its base interest rate to 5%, marking the first deduction since March 2020. The rate had been held at 5.25% since August last year, which was the highest level since 2008. It comes as new data suggests the cost of living crisis is easing thanks to inflation cooling off. GPs in England have voted to limit the number of appointments available in their first collective action since 1964. NHS England says it could cause significant disruption across the whole health service. The British Medical Association says it's taking action over what it describes as a lack of funding for GPs. It comes despite the Health Secretary warning that while the previous government failed to recruit enough doctors, reducing services would only punish patients. Tensions are rising in the Middle East as Iran orders retaliatory strikes on Israel following the death of a top Hamas leader. Thousands turned out for the funeral of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, who was the terror group's most senior political chief. He was killed during a strike on the Iranian capital this week, which immediately raised fears of a broader escalation in the region. Both Britain's Foreign and Defence Secretaries are in Qatar for talks aimed at quelling the tensions. Back in the UK, 7 Just Stop Oil protesters have been arrested after blocking the passenger search area at Heathrow's Terminal 5. The group were seen holding signs saying oil kills and sign the treaty in front of the barriers to the area for departing passengers. Both the Met Police and Heathrow said minimal disruption was caused. It comes after a protest on Tuesday that saw 2 activists arrested for splattering orange paint throughout the terminal. And just when you thought it was time to enjoy summer, Thunderstorms are expected to hit at any moment now. Yellow warnings are in place for much of England and Wales as the heatwave continues. But heavy showers, lightning and thunder will break the hot spell soon, with travel disruption and power cuts possible. Flood alerts are also in place in parts of the Midlands. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 8 minutes past 2.
Some breaking news for you now. A press conference with the Prime Minister will be held later today in Downing Street this afternoon.
Keir Starmer will address 2 nights of violence as riots were sparked across the country following the horrific incident in Southport, with protesters clashing with police in London, Manchester and Hartlepool.
Well, angry crowds threw flares and bottles at the gates of Downing Street. Over 100 people have been arrested. There were similar scenes too in Hartlepool.
In response, Keir Starmer has called police chiefs to Downing Street for an urgent meeting on the riots and the police action taken against them.
And now we know that after this meeting with the police chiefs, there will be a press conference, a conference to the nation, where we will no doubt learn what the Prime Minister told the police, what the police told the Prime Minister, and what, if any, action will be taken. We're expecting that press conference a little bit later this afternoon.
And I'm sure, people have seen things that have happened recently in Leeds and other parts of the country. And here we are.
The police arriving on Downing Street now. These are live pictures from Downing Street. Senior members of the police have been called to meet the Prime Minister to talk about the unrest on our streets.
I'm sure people, as I was just about to say there, will be looking at those images of people being arrested, see the numbers, 100 people arrested, and will be thinking, well, it seems that the police learnt how to police with the riots over the last 2 days. So I think many people will be hoping that that will be part of the subject of this discussion, that people are very concerned about issues to do with two-tier policing, but also just the fact that this seems to be a regular occurrence now, clashes with police and general disorder, and I think it adds to this feeling that that the country is sort of descending into chaos, and that not only the police but primarily the government need to get this situation under control.
Yeah, and we will be, of course, learning what has been said in this meeting, if there's any action that we'll be taking as a result of this meeting, or if this is, again, a bit of a talking shop. There are going to be questions for the Prime Minister at that press conference, one of his first press conferences on a substantive issue. Let's speak now to Mark White, who is on Downing Street for us, our Home and Security Editor, of course. Mark, the police are continuing to arrive in Downing Street. This is a significant meeting.
Yes, just to say I'm staying out of vision because we have some of those policing leaders, as you've just seen, arriving here with potentially more in the coming seconds, and I'd be rather unpopular with my colleagues from elsewhere in the press if I'm blocking their shot. So apologies for that. But this is clearly a very important meeting because there is a great deal of concern about the potential for other events, other disorder in the days ahead. And that's why you've got these policing leaders coming in here from the Metropolitan Police, of course, but right across the country. A number of forces are represented here, and those forces that can't be here in terms of their chief constables in person, quite a number of them, including, we believe, the Merseyside Chief Constable is dialing in as a video call. And also there are representatives from the National Police Chiefs Council who will be here, in particular representatives of the National Police Chiefs Council resilience arm, so really looking at the resources that the police have, what they call mutual aid, and mutual aid is the assistance that police forces can give each other right across the country. So if one police force, say a particularly small police force, has an issue, then it can call on its neighbouring forces to provide that mutual aid in rapid succession. And one of the things they'll be discussing, obviously, is just the robust nature of that response, how they can ensure that right across the country there are key areas where they can rapidly deploy this extra assistance if it's required. And of course, they'll also be looking at any intelligence they have about potential protests or other disorder that might come in the days ahead. The difficulty they'll always have is that there is often the potential for these events and disorder and protests to gather a momentum of its own, for one protest to spark another protest, as we've seen just last night, with the first protest obviously having taken place the day before in Southport, and then those protests and disorder spreading to Hartlepool, to Manchester, to Aldershot, and of course just yards from where I am in the heart of central London. The very latest we can tell you about that is the Metropolitan Police confirming that 111 people were arrested in connection with that disorder. Now, the reason the number of arrests are so high in London is just because it's right in the heart of the capital. The police have an expertise in dealing with protests. They have significant resources that they deploy, so they're able to arrest people that they see or believe have been involved in disorder very rapidly, very quickly. Other police forces take a more slow time approach. The resilience and the resources they have probably allow them to just contain a situation but not to push forward and make too many arrests for fear of exacerbating that disorder.
Well, Mark White, thank you so much for joining us there outside Downing Street. Of course, we're going to be back with Mark a little bit later on, and indeed inside Downing Street at 4 o'clock when we expect that press conference to take place. Of course, it will be played out in full here on GB News.
Now, as we've been discussing throughout the show, a 17-year-old male has been charged with the murder of the 3 girls in Southport and has been named as Axel Rudakabana after he appeared in Liverpool's Crown Court.
Well, Elsie Stancombe, Alice De Silva Aguilera and BB King died after a mass stabbing at a dance session on Hart Street on Monday.
The teenager has also been charged with 10 counts of attempted murder and the possession of a bladed article. He has since been taken to a youth detention centre.
Let's get the very latest now from Liverpool Crown Court with GB News national reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, we've now seen the official court sketch. We've had the suspect named. What was he like inside the court?
Well, Axel Rudakabana, he attended 2 hearings in the courts behind me. First in the youth court, in the lower court, the magistrates, and then it was passed on to the Crown Court. In both, he said nothing, but he was named. Also were named were the victims of those alleged murders. The girls you've just named, but also 10 of those named in the attempted murder charges as well. 2 that we can name, Leanne Lucas and John Hayes. The other 8, because they had children, were not legally permitted to name them. But in the court, Axel Rudakabana, he struck a quiet figure for sure, but he smiled as he entered the magistrates' court, looking towards the press gallery behind the dock, and then he sat inside the dock with his grey tracksuit covering his face, occasionally peeking above the hem of that sweatshirt to look around the room before ducking his eyes and his ears below his jumper. The same was repeated in the Crown Court, and that was where this restriction on naming him was lifted. Now, Mr. Justice Menery was competing several concerns and legal arguments in that discussion on lifting the reporting restriction. On one hand, there were concerns about the defendant's welfare and the welfare of his family so soon after the mass stabbing attack on Monday. But on the other hand, there were concerns about the public interest. And most keenly and finally, the decision was made by the judge to reveal his name and release the reporting restrictions to reduce the vacuum of information, which he said had been filled with nonsense, which had allowed idiots, in his term, to conduct so much rioting this week. This was the view of the press as well, as we made the protestation to release the name to fill that gap that we've been unable to report this week. So competing between the defendant's welfare and the public interest. But the public interest won out to fill that information gap after so much of the rioting we've seen this week ahead of that meeting between Keir Starmer and the Chief Constables at Downing Street later today. It was also the position of the Youth Justice Team that he should not be named, and the police. We understand the police did not want him to be named in order to maintain civility where they could in the protests in the region. It's their view that naming him wouldn't reduce the anger, perhaps contrasting with the view that nonsense had filled the vacuum, but actually this was just about more broader anger in Britain at the moment, in England in particular, as you've seen that rioting in Hartlepool and also in Manchester, London, and of course in Southport on Tuesday evening. He will next appear in court on the 25th of October, potentially via a remote link, Axel Rudapakana. But before then, he will be remanded in youth custody in a secure unit on those 3 charges of murder, 10 charges of attempted murder, and a charge of possession of a bladed article. It was named in the lower court as a kitchen knife that was curved.
Charlie, thank you very much for joining us there outside the court. Fascinating, fascinating case this. And we can now share with you a picture of the suspect as a younger child. This is not what the suspect looks like today, but this is a picture of the suspect, Axel Rudapakana, some years ago when he was quite a bit younger, but it is the first official photograph that we have been able to show of you.
I'm sure given the horror of this crime, there'll be a lot of people who are feeling strangely relieved to know his name, and even if in a younger photograph or a court sketch, to be able to put a face to that name and to know a little bit more about the person who has been arrested as the suspect in this absolutely hideous crime.
Now, of course, there's a lot of rumour online that is not substantiated, and it would be wrong to discuss any sort of hearsay or rumour. We don't want to do anything to prejudice what is a vital court case to take place. But again, there, the first official photo we've been able to show you.
Now, coming up, the BBC is under fire for continuing to pay disgraced former presenter Huw Edwards. Have they got a culture of cover-up? We'll put that to a former correspondent.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
The sunny spell that many have experienced this week makes this the perfect time to seek inspiration for fresh, beautiful food to fit the weather. Hannah Harley-Young from Crazy Sexy Food joins me once again for the latest in our Taste of Britain series. And to go alongside the return of the glorious sunshine, she recommends tequila.
To be honest with you, it's more about my total love of tequila. It is my favourite drink. I have my favourite cocktail ready to be shaked for you in a second, which is obviously the margarita. But I think also I just love this sort of general story of tequila. Tequila, a bit like with champagne, can only be produced in the region of Tequila in Mexico. But I've actually brought for you, interestingly, a brand that is London-based. This was set up by Tom and Jack. They were drinking, I think, in sort of 2018, 2019, somewhere in South London, and realised that tequila could actually be quite enjoyable.
Do you know what it's made of?
It is. It's made from the blue agave plant. Now, 300 million of these plants are harvested every year. It takes between 8 to 12 years to harvest. Their tequila is made to be drank with tonic, which is not your usual accompaniment with tequila. Usually it's lime, it's a margarita. With a Blanco tequila, the idea is that the process is that once it's distilled, that is the end, it's bottled and it's sold. This is the Reposado. I haven't actually opened that, but if you do want to have a smell, you can open it. But the idea behind this is that it's been rested, so it's rested in oak barrels. I actually love people's behaviour behind tequila now. I think back in the day it had a little slightly bad rep that you'd drink cheap shots and maybe make some bad mistakes on a night out, whereas now we're actually starting to appreciate it and respect it.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Isabel Webster. Thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 23 minutes past 2.
Now, the BBC Director General Tim Davie is to face difficult questions from the government about what the corporation knew about the Huw Edwards case after that broadcaster's former presenter pleaded guilty to accessing indecent images of children.
The corporation said it knew of the veteran broadcaster's arrest on suspicion of serious offences in November, but continued employing him until April. The Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, will likely raise questions to the BBC chief about why he continued to receive such a large salary, which marked a £40,000 pay rise from 2022 to 2023.
Well, we can now speak with the former BBC correspondent, Michael Cole, because, Michael, a lot of people will respect the BBC brand, recognise the BBC brand is one of those things that is known about Britain around the world, and see it be dragged through the mud like it has been this week.
Good afternoon, Tom. Good afternoon, Emma. A cover-up would imply a criminal conspiracy to conceal illegal activity and to protect the guilty. Now, that's quite a high threshold leap. What I would say is that BBC's performance, Tom, has been abject from the beginning. And it's not as if they didn't have enough warning. When a young man in South Wales received £35,000 from Huw Edwards for illicit, explicit sexual images, his mother went all the way to Cardiff and spent 25 minutes at the BBC studios there complaining about Edwards' behaviour. And her complaint was met in a rather desultory fashion by the BBC. And it wasn't until the Sun newspaper took up the case without naming Edwards that anything was done. Now, that case of that young man in South Wales has nothing to do with these three charges which Edwards yesterday pleaded guilty to. But it does indicate how ponderous, how bureaucratic, how slow to react the BBC always is in these situations. And Tom and Emily, it's not as if they haven't had practice. We've had Jimmy Savile. We've had the appalling Stuart Hall. We've had other people, including Rolf Harris. They've been through this mill before, and yet they're still incapable of controlling a situation like this. And I have to wonder about the Director General, Tim Davie. He says he's appalled and the BBC has no place for activities of this kind, behaviour of this kind, and there we see him. Now, Tim Davie is probably a wizard of a marketing man selling programmes and maybe fizzy drinks, but he's never been a journalist. He's never spent a single day in a newsroom. And the other title of the Director General is Editor-in-Chief. And it does actually require the nous of a journalist to see the small cloud on the horizon that then turns into a force 10 gale. And the BBC should have been on top of this from the very beginning. And even after Edwards was arrested last November, as Emma has just said, they carried on paying him and even paid him an increase in his enormous inflated salary.
This is obviously going to have a serious impact on the public's trust of the BBC. You've listed there a number of different a number of different scandals that have surrounded the BBC. One of the other most recent ones is with Strictly Come Dancing. So I guess the question is, what is the future of the BBC? Because it seems to be some kind of cultural problem of accountability that they have.
Well, Emma, I think that's a spot-on question. It really is. This couldn't have come at a worse time for the BBC, because it is hoping for a renewal of its Royal Charter in 2027 and the continued imposition of a poll tax by any other name known as the licence fee, which fewer and fewer people are paying, and mainly the old people, who is the demographic the BBC loves to ignore. They're the people who support it financially. So it is a problem. In another realm, it might be a question for Miss Nandy to be asking Tim Davie about his own position, because when you're at the top of any organisation, you take the ultimate responsibility. And this thing should have been invigilated very fiercely from the very beginning. As I said, they've had enough warning, they've had enough practice, and they seem to be utterly inept at dealing with cleaning up their own household. It's not enough to issue statements to the staff saying this information, this behaviour is not to be tolerated. And of course, the staff, the ordinary foot soldiers, the sort of people I was for 20 years and more, they hate this. They hate it. They hate the inflated salaries that people get, and they hate the way they are cosseted, and when they're in trouble, how they're protected. So a lot of questions, as you said, Emma and Tom, need to be answered. And the BBC has to come up with some convincing answers to those questions, because this has been an appalling display and a very black day for the BBC.
And it's worth noting, of course, that Huw Edwards was the third highest paid star at the BBC last year, despite having left the corporation midway through that financial year. He was the face of the corporation when they announced the death of our late Queen. He led the general election coverage in 2019. It's hard to think of a face on the BBC in the last few years who has been more prominent and placed in a greater position of respect. And yet now we know that this week he's pleaded guilty to downloading these illegal images, and also we're learning story after story about inappropriate behaviour, alleged inappropriate behaviour of Huw Edwards when he was at the BBC towards younger staff, not alleged to be illegal, but alleged to be deeply inappropriate. Clearly, some people have turned their eyes the other way, Michael Cole.
Yeah, it's a catalogue of shame, and you summarise it brilliantly. One thing you didn't say, which I think is worth noting, is that he was also involved in a BBC programme involving 11 to 18-year-olds called The School Report, where people at school were encouraged to do their own television reports. He was intimately involved in that. This man's a father of 5 children. His wife has now left him, which says perhaps volumes. It is an appalling situation. And of course, it is quite right and proper that people who are in positions of prominence and are holding others to account on a daily basis, and that's their job, should be above reproach. We can't all be, St. Teresa of Avila or Mother Teresa herself or Sir Francis of Assisi, but we have to conduct ourselves in a certain way that does not bring the corporation into disrepute. And that goes on time after time. And even some other people on that list of the high earners have to look at themselves and wonder about their own conduct. I mean, it's time for a big house clearing at the BBC. And if we don't get it, the BBC can be asked and wonder about its future, because it's not assured. The poll tax, known as the licence fee, is extremely unpopular. Young people are no longer watching the BBC. The whole situation has changed. People turn to other sources, including GBNews, for straightforward and honest news. And the BBC has no longer the position of trust it once had, which I greatly reject and regret, because I served it for 20 years and 3 months. I was proud to do so. And my work, not me, because television news is a collaborative endeavour. My work won 2 Royal Television Society awards. So I was proud to work for the BBC, but I was just one of the foot soldiers. I wasn't on these enormous, inflated, ridiculous salaries which are paid now.
Yeah, and one of the good guys. Michael Cole, we're going to have to leave it there, but former BBC correspondent, really appreciate your time and your thoughts. What a story.
Now, coming up, Donald Trump sparks outrage for questioning Vice President Kamala Harris's identity at a black journalist convention. Could this impact his presidential campaign?
Good afternoon, I'm Sophia Wensler with your headlines at 2:30. A 17-year-old boy accused of murdering 3 young girls in Southport has now been named as Axel Rudakabana. 3 children, 7-year-old Elsie Stancoom, Alice Aguiar, who was 9, and 6-year-old BB King were killed during the attack at a holiday club. He's been remanded in youth detention accommodation after appearing at Liverpool Crown Court this morning. Meanwhile, angry crowds took to the streets of Manchester, Hartlepool and London, with some declaring their support for Tommy Robinson, saying, "We want our country back." It's after social media posts falsely claimed the Southport attack suspect was a Muslim asylum seeker who'd crossed the Channel in a small boat. The Prime Minister will deliver a speech outside Downing Street later after discussing the civil unrest with police chiefs. In other news, reports suggest that Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is being released from a Russian prison as part of an exchange. The news, which was first reported by Bloomberg, would see the journalist walk free after he was sentenced to 16 years in prison last month. Back in the UK, the Bank of England has cut its base interest rate to 5%, marking the first reduction since March 2020. The rate had been held at 5.25% since August last year, which was the highest level since 2008. GPs in England have voted to limit the number of appointments available in their first collective action since 1964. NHS England says it could cause significant disruption across the whole health service. The British Medical Association says it's taking action over what it describes as a lack of funding for GPs. The Culture Secretary will meet the head of the BBC today after it was revealed that former news presenter Huw Edwards was arrested in November but continued to be employed until April. He pleaded guilty yesterday to charges related to receiving indecent images of children during an online chat. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Hello, welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. It could be quite an impactful day today with torrential downpours, a risk of thunderstorms for many areas of England and Wales. Further north, it will be a drier day, but a change is on the way from Friday as these weather fronts will push in from the north and west, bringing some cloudier skies later on this afternoon to parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but it will brighten up for a time here. But it's further south across England and Wales where there's that risk of thunderstorms and the warning in force. We could see some very torrential downpours and localised impacts due to heavy rain and water on the roads. That could bring disruption to travel. So a humid feeling day as a result of that. Not everywhere's going to see these thunderstorms. You might get away with a fairly dry and sunny day. And actually, as I said, across parts of northern Scotland for this afternoon, it's going to brighten up for a time after a bit of a cloudier start this morning, but more rain is on the way throughout this evening. Across eastern areas of Scotland, risk of the odd shower, but some sunny spells, and it's a warmer day today here than yesterday. Parts of Northern Ireland as well seeing a fine end to the day, but these thunderstorms across England and Wales will likely continue into this evening as it stays quite humid, so further disruption is likely into this evening and overnight. But it will slowly ease off overnight as that risk does fade away. So a fairly dry night to come once those thunderstorms do push away to the east for most of us, but across the north and west it is turning much wetter and windier overnight. For many of us, it's still staying quite humid and muggy, temperatures in the mid-teens as a minimum. But to start the day, there'll be plenty of brightness. So a brighter day, still that humid feel around, and that will allow some thunderstorms to break out potentially across eastern areas of England. But for most of us, a fairly dry day, or at least a start to the day, as we will see some wet and windy weather spread into parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland later on in the afternoon. But ahead of that, still feeling very warm in the sunshine. Bye-bye.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. Slow for the M61 northbound in Lancashire, heading towards junction 30 of the M6. Slow for the M6 southbound in Cheshire due to an accident between junction 17 Sandbach and 16 for Stoke-on-Trent. Delays on the M5 northbound in Worcestershire due to an earlier caravan fire between junction 8 for the M50 and 7 for Worcester. All lanes have now reopened. Very slow for the M25 anti-clockwise in Buckinghamshire due to an earlier car fire between junction 16 for the M40 and 13 for Staines. Queues on the M25 clockwise due to an earlier accident between junction 23 for South Mims and 24 Potters Bar. And queues on the M25 anti-clockwise in Kent. There's a lane closed for an accident just before junction 1A Dartford Tunnel. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 38 minutes past 2, which means that in 22 minutes, it's Martin Daubney. And Martin, what's coming up at 3 o'clock?
Well, Britain is on the edge. Law and order is at a crucial junction. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, Sir Keir Starmer is addressing the nation on this matter. What we have isn't working. Last night at the Cenotaph, I was handcuffed by police simply for reporting on the protest that was breaking out there. Over 100 people were arrested. The police were kettling them in. Very, very different type of protest to what I've seen in the same place when I've been on pro-Palestine marches. Tom and Emma, I was begging police to arrest people with that projector putting from the river to the sea on Big Ben. Images that shamed the world. The police had no interest. Two-tier policing in plain sight, just upon me. This is spreading out across Britain. We've seen riots now in Southport, in Hartlepool, and in Aldershot. Yesterday, there was a protest against an asylum seeker hotel, a peaceful protest. The police turned up with a helicopter, riot vans, 9 cop cars, dogs, mums, dads, left stunned by what they felt was a completely over-the-top police response. What's going on with law and order? Whose side are the police on? Can this be put right? All eyes on 4 o'clock, and I'll be carrying that live on my show, 3 till 6.
Well, we will certainly be tuning in, Martin. Thank you very much for that preview.
Can't believe they handcuffed him. But now, at a recent convention for black journalists, the former President Donald Trump questioned Kamala Harris's racial identity.
He claimed she had focused on her Asian American heritage recently when she, quote, until recently, when she recently became a black person. Those are the words of Donald Trump.
But how much will this damage his chances of becoming president? We're joined now by Republican overseas spokesperson Jennifer Ewing. Thank you for joining us, Jennifer. Will it damage his presidential campaign?
You know, the sound bites are not going to be great on this. What he was trying to point out is that Kamala Harris has been cherry-picking her ethnicity for whatever audience it suits. And he's not wrong in saying that in 2016, when she became a senator in California, I mean, you can look up, it was the Associated Press and probably 25 articles all calling her the first Indian American senator. So she had been identifying as an Indian American for quite some time, and now she's, but her father is partially black. So I mean, the shame in all of this is the Republicans have done such a good job of staying away from identity politics, and I feel like Trump stepped right into their trap. And the sound bites are not great. Does the content of what he said make people think differently of him? Probably not, because I don't know if you watched the entire thing, but first of all, it was the National Association of Black Journalists, and I believe it was the first time a Republican had addressed them in 20 years. So that was one big thing that he went. Number two, Kamala Harris was supposed to be there, and she didn't show up. Number three, they were 30 minutes late. And then the first question that they asked him was this sort of, you know, a little bit aggressive, shall we say, and he commented on how aggressive it was. And then it just deteriorated from there. However, as the time went on, I think there were a lot of people that watched it and said, okay, it was a little obvious they were trying to do some gotchas, and he stood his ground, and he didn't want to be disrespected. But yeah, I wish he had not said that.
I mean, it's perfectly possible to see that Kamala Harris is, you know, her mother is of Indian heritage, her father is of African-American heritage. And I suppose it's understandable that when she's talking to an audience of Indians, she's like, oh, well, you're just like my mum, or when she's talking to a black audience, you're just like my dad.
Yes.
So she can talk to those two different diasporas, I suppose.
Absolutely, and one of the biggest growing populations in the United States are mixed-race people, right? So her father was partially Jamaican, her mother's Indian, you know. So people are mixed these days, and I agree with you. There's nothing wrong with her talking to different audience. I just think his point was like, she's cherry-picking, and he wanted to point that out.
And this is also coming in the context of, obviously, after the attempted assassination on Trump, there was this huge uptick in support. I think his gesture with his fist in the air really got a lot of people riled, maybe turned a lot of people to Trump that perhaps before were not so keen. But then we saw, after Biden's resignation, Kamala Harris raising record funds in such a short amount of time, and now it's like Kamala mania. And now with this comment coming at exactly this time, is this not going to damage his chances and knock him back even further in relation to Kamala Harris?
Well, if you look at the actual voting issues that people are voting on, including black voters and Indian voters and white voters and Asian voters, all sorts of voters, it's the economy and inflation, and number two, the crisis we have at the southern border. And you could argue that a lot of black people are very affected, especially by, well, both of those, really. And when they go into the polls, are they going to be thinking, I don't like what he said, back in July 31st to a convention, or are they going to say, actually, I don't like the way that Biden and Harris ran the economy, opened the southern border, and I want our life back on track.
Is it possible that even some of those minority supporters of Trump might be, perhaps actually agree with him because they are so sort of dead set against identity politics?
No, Emma, you're completely right. And that's why I say, it's a bit of a roulette wheel as to how anybody that watches that, or more likely watches clips of it, right, will react to it. So some people will say, yeah, I don't appreciate being pandered on. I'm not going to vote on immutable characteristics like the color of my skin or the gender I happen to be born. I'm going to be voting on what's better for me and my family, and our lives and our safety. And I think that's what it will come down to. But it's, it's a rather, unfortunate news cycle, shall we say.
And I think we've started to see a strategy from the Democrats that is a lot smarter than the strategy last time round. Before, when Trump said something like this, or said something about Hillary Clinton, they'd say sexist. They'd say racist, and a lot of people just think, hang on, that sort of washes over. What the Kamala Harris campaign has started to say is not sexist and racist, but is the word weird. Yeah. And this is coming up, and time again they put out a statement about J.D. Vance, about how quote unquote weird he is. The official campaign put out this statement, and I wonder, is that a more pertinent attack line? That Donald Trump sort
gives them the ick.
Is
just strange in a way, and perhaps that cuts through as a message more than just sort of the old sexist, racist words.
Sure, and you know what? To the sort of coastal elites and the media crowd, it might cut through that J.D. Vance, because he dares to be a Catholic and talk about family values and this stuff, is weird, versus Kamala Harris, who one of her first events was on the RuPaul drag show. I mean, my personal view is the average American that's voting is going to look at one of those people as weird, and I don't think it's J.D. Vance, okay? So, but again, you know, everybody has a different opinion. And let's keep in mind that this is the sugar rush from the relief that it's no longer Biden. She hasn't given an interview yet. So this will fade, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a fascinating election, much closer than the British election. Jennifer Ewing, thank you so much for coming in and talking through that issue.
Coming up, we'll be joined by British shot put champion who has a lot to say about the controversy surrounding an Algerian boxer's acceptance into the Olympics, despite questions around her gender eligibility.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Prince Harry also revealed that he wouldn't bring his wife Meghan Markle back to the UK over safety concerns.
Let's talk to royal correspondent Michael Cole.
Good morning, Stephen. Good morning, Ellie. I mean, they live in California. I'm not sure what the murder rate is there, but that's a more dangerous place than Britain's at any time of the day. And of course, he compromised his own safety when he said in his book, Spare, his autobiography, which was Ghost Britain, that he'd personally killed 25 Taliban when he was serving with the British Army in Afghanistan. Well, that painted a target for life on the back of himself and his family, which was a very unwise thing for him to do. The other thing which struck me, it was that he invoked the name of the late Queen, saying that he'd had several conversations with his grandmother, and she'd been very, very supportive in his battle. He sees himself, and it's the word he's used, as a dragon slayer against the popular press, the tabloid press, and he's continuing with that. Of course, his brother, Prince William, has settled, but also in the programme was Hugh Grant. Now, Hugh Grant also has settled, as indeed did I, when I received an apology from News Group. I believe in a free and unfettered press. Newspapers are having a bad time at the moment, losing circulation, losing advertising. Young people don't read newspapers. And so I felt that the right thing to do was to settle. I didn't want to take punitive action against newspapers.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes. Thank you for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Stephen Dixon, and thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is the nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 10 to 3.
Now, Algerian boxer Imane Khalif has won her first bout at the Olympics after Italian opponent Angela Carini abandoned the match just 46 seconds in.
Khalif's participation in the event has been a source of controversy, having been disqualified from the women's boxing World Boxing Championships last year because of elevated testosterone levels.
Well, joining us now to discuss this is British shot put champion Amelia Campbell. Amelia, there is a lot of confusion around this case because Algeria appear to have put out a statement saying that she's always been a girl, that there's nothing that's sort of transgender about any of this.
Yes, I've heard those claims, but ultimately, you know, this individual, if they've failed a testosterone test, then chances are they are considered a DSD athlete. So they have most likely gone through male puberty and therefore would have that male advantage, which is incredibly massive in a sport like boxing. There have been studies done, 162% average more punching power for a male. And we can't deny that difference is there. And for the IOC to not do a simple sex test and not, protect the women in this sport, it's really, really been sad, scary, and just frustrating to watch, women's careers. They've worked their whole lives for this. And
As
to
an
have
athlete,
to, be scared enough to back, just to say, I've been hit, I've never been hit that hard before. I don't feel comfortable competing.
And you could see in the footage, actually, of the fight, the power of that punch hitting the female competitor. As an athlete, what do you feel about the sort of safety aspect of this in a sport like boxing, where it's obviously, potentially fatal if you get punched in the wrong way, at the wrong angle, by somebody who can punch with so much more force?
Exactly. These DSD athletes are banned in athletics for, the advantage that they retain. So, that's not even a violent contact sport. But boxing is a very violent, contact sport. And there is some serious safety issues, and I am honestly just shocked that the IOC hasn't taken more care for the athletes, for the female athletes' sake.
And to be clear, DSD is difference of sexual development, what some people might call intersex, or people who have naturally been born with unusual levels of various hormones and all the rest of it.
Yes, exactly. This case with Caster Semenya, she had female genitalia but possessed internal testes, therefore had gone through male puberty. And it is, a really unfortunate situation for these athletes. And I do really sympathize with them, because it must be incredibly frustrating as an individual to, have this condition. And obviously now it's become such a controversy at the Olympics, but it really should have been prevented from the start by the IOC. A simple sex test. Let's make this fair. Let's protect the women's category. We've worked so hard and come so far. Let's not, push it back.
No, that's a really, really sensible point. I don't understand why we haven't had Olympic-level testing in this case. Amelia Campbell, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for discussing that issue for us.
Yeah, you would think that they'd just be in a separate category, wouldn't you?
Yeah, or that they could just do a definitive test and clear up all of the miscommunication. That's it from us today, but please do join us again at 12 tomorrow. Up next, it's Martin Daubney.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. It could be quite an impactful day today with torrential downpours, a risk of thunderstorms for many areas of England and Wales. Further north, it will be a drier day, but a change is on the way from Friday as these weather fronts will push in from the north and west, bringing some cloudier skies later on this afternoon to parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but it will brighten up for a time here. But it's further south across England and Wales where there's that risk of thunderstorms and the warning in force. We could see some very torrential downpours and localised impacts due to heavy rain and water on the roads. That could bring disruption to travel. So a humid feeling day as a result of that. Not everywhere's going to see these thunderstorms. You might get away with a fairly dry and sunny day. And actually, as I said, across parts of northern Scotland for this afternoon, it's going to brighten up for a time after a bit of a cloudier start this morning, but more rain is on the way throughout this evening. Across eastern areas of Scotland, risk of the odd shower, but some sunny spells, and it's a warmer day today here than yesterday. Parts of Northern Ireland as well seeing a fine end to the day, but these thunderstorms across England and Wales will likely continue into this evening as it stays quite humid. So further disruption is likely into this evening and overnight, but it will slowly ease off overnight as that risk does fade away. So a fairly dry night to come once those thunderstorms do push away to the east for most of us, but across the north and west it is turning much wetter and windier overnight. For many of us, it's still staying quite humid and muggy, temperatures in the mid-teens as a minimum. But to start the day, there'll be plenty of brightness. So a brighter day, still that humid feel around, and that will allow some thunderstorms to break out potentially across eastern areas of England. But for most of us, a fairly dry day, or at least a start to the day, as we will see some wet and windy weather spread into parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland later on in the afternoon. But ahead of that, still feeling very warm in the sunshine. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Celebrate a spectacular summer with your chance to win an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash in our Great British Giveaway. It's the biggest prize of the year so far, and it's totally tax-free. What would you spend that on? Luxury holidays, a new car, or just put it away for a rainy day? Whatever you do with £30,000 in tax-free cash, make sure you don't miss out on a chance to make it yours. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me.